The water hit the Brazilian cherry hardwood with the sound of a promise breaking. Each drop carried a price tag Garrett Holloway had stopped calculating after the first $1,000. His knees pressed against the soaked floor of the penthouse office, the cold seeping through denim that had survived 3 New England winters and one daughter who believed puddles existed to be jumped in. The beam from his headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating copper pipes that belonged in a museum, not a building where people trusted their safety to outdated infrastructure. 2:47 in the morning. The Seaport District stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston's newest monument to money and the illusion of permanence. Garrett's toolbox sat open beside him, wrenches arranged by size the way his mentor Finn had taught him 30 years ago, when precision mattered more than speed and a man's word carried weight his bank account never would. The woman stood in the doorway like she'd never learned how to occupy space without purpose. Her Armani vest carried the kind of tailoring that whispered rather than shouted charcoal fabric, conforming to shoulders that had carried burdens Garrett could only guess at. The Cartier tank watch on her wrist caught his headlamp beam, throwing fractured light across walls decorated with abstract art that probably cost more than his truck. Her phone vibrated against the mahogany desk screen, lighting up with names Garrett assumed mattered in circles, where his calloused hands never reached. The numbers on that screen told their own story. 47 missed calls, each one a thread in whatever web she'd woven before a burst pipe decided structure mattered more than schedules. How long her voice carried the manufactured calm of someone who'd learned emotion was weakness in rooms where weakness meant losing. The kind of control that came from years of translating fear into strategy, panic into spreadsheets. Garrett didn't look up from the pipe joint he was inspecting. Water damage had spread further than his initial assessment suggested. The ceiling showed dark stains that spoke of slow leaks and deferred maintenance problems. Money could have prevented if anyone had been paying attention. Depends. The single word hung in the flooded office. No elaboration, no reassurance, just the truth delivered by someone who'd stopped trying to make reality more palatable years ago. She crossed the space between doorway and disaster with steps that suggested she'd worn heels so long she'd forgotten what solid ground felt like. I have a board meeting at 6. $80 million. How long to fix this? Garrett straightened vertebrae protesting the movement. 43 years had left their mark in ways that showed up around 2 in the morning when the work demanded positions the human spine wasn't designed to hold. He wiped his hands on the shop rag that lived in his back pocket, the fabric stiff with use, and memories of jobs that paid bills but never quite filled the space Natalie left behind. Like I said, depends. Depends on what you want me to fix. The confusion on her face would have been satisfying if Garrett had any energy left for satisfaction. Instead, he pointed to the ceiling, tracing the water damage that spread like a map of neglect. I can stop the immediate leak in 2 hours, patch it enough to get you through your meeting. You walk into that boardroom dry, confident, $80 million richer. The floor is ruined, but that's cosmetic. You can handle cosmetic. And the other option, fix it right. 5 hours minimum, maybe 6. I tear out the damaged pipe, replace the joint properly, inspect the whole system to make sure this doesn't happen again next week or next month. But you miss your meeting. You lose your 80 million. You have to explain to whoever's blowing up your phone why structure matters more than schedules. The watch on her wrist caught light again as she checked the time. 2:51. The math was simple enough for anyone with a calculator. 5 hours put them at 7:51, nearly 2 hours past a meeting that apparently held her career in its hands. If I cancel this meeting, I lose the contract. Her voice had shifted, the manufactured calm cracking just enough to let something human slip through. Technova's been pursuing this merger for 18 months. The board expects me to close. If I walk in there and say I need to reschedule because of plumbing, Garrett cut her off with a gesture toward the window. You see that building across the street? The residential tower with the nice balconies and the gym on the ground floor. 50 families live there, maybe more. Kids who go to school, parents who trust that when they flip a light switch or turn on a faucet, the systems work because someone somewhere gave a damn about doing things right instead of fast. This pipe here, it's connected to that building system. Everything in this block shares infrastructure because some developer in '85 decided cutting corners would pad his profit margin. He paused, letting her process the geography of consequence. If I patch this, the pressure redistributes. Weak points get weaker. In a week, maybe two, the whole system fails. Not just your office, not just this penthouse. 50 families wake up to flooding or worse, electrical fires from water damage they never saw coming. You want to know what the right choice is? I can't tell you that, but I can tell you what the choice is. The silence that followed carried weight. Outside Boston slept the kind of sleep that came from assuming infrastructure held that the invisible systems supporting modern life remained reliable because they always had. Her phone buzzed again. Another call she wasn't answering. Another person expecting her to perform miracles on demand. Fix it right. The words came out quiet, decision made without the drama Garrett expected from someone about to sacrifice $80 million. She closed her eyes briefly, the gesture almost prayerful, if prayer had any place in penthouses that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes. If I lose the contract because I did the right thing, at least I sleep at night. If I cause harm to 50 families because I chose profit over safety, I couldn't live with that. Garrett felt something shift in his chest. The sensation was unfamiliar enough that it took him a moment to identify it as surprise. In 2 years of running Holloway Systems Repair, he'd worked for hundreds of clients. Wealthy ones, desperate ones, demanding ones who treated him like a servant, whose opinion mattered less than the doorman's. Not once had any of them chosen ethics over expedience when the cost was this high. You sure about this? His hand rested on the pipe wrench, metal cool against his palm. Because once I start the real fix, there's no going back. You're committed. She opened her eyes and met his gaze directly. The manufactured calm was gone, replaced by something Garrett recognized from mirrors on bad days. Exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying too much for too long without anyone offering to share the weight. I'm sure. The memory hit him without warning, the way grief always did when he stopped moving long enough for it to catch up. Natalie's voice in their old kitchen, 3 years gone, now explaining to 6-year-old Hazel why they couldn't afford the new bike all her friends had. Sometimes we do the hard thing because it's right, even when right costs more than easy. Hazel had nodded with the kind of wisdom children possess before the world taught them cynicism, before they learned that doing right often meant losing. Garrett shook off the memory and pulled out his phone. Speed dial connected him to Finn McAllister's number before the second ring. The old man answered with the clarity of someone who'd stopped sleeping through nights years ago when age decided rest was negotiable. Finn, need you here. Seaport District, the Wellington Building. We've got a situation. The pipe burst in the penthouse is connected to the whole block system. Everything's compromised. If we don't address it now, we're looking at catastrophic failure. Could be days, could be hours. But when it goes, it'll take out 50 units minimum. The pause on the other end carried decades of experience. Garrett could picture his mentor sitting in the workshop they'd shared for 15 years before Natalie's death changed everything. Finn would be at his workbench, the same space where he'd taught a 23-year-old kid fresh out of engineering school that degrees didn't mean much if you couldn't fix what broke. That integrity wasn't something you displayed on a wall certificate, but something you proved every time you chose difficult over easy. Son, you know what that kind of repair costs. Finn's voice carried the weight of calculations made and remade. 200,000 minimum for materials alone. Then there's labor permits, inspections. You're talking $250,000 before this is done. Nobody pays that on your say-so. Nobody trusts a contractor enough to write that check. The woman was watching him now, her attention focused with the kind of intensity that probably served her well in boardrooms, where wars were fought with PowerPoint slides and profit projections. Garrett turned slightly, meeting her eyes. She needed to understand what he was asking, what this meant. I'm not asking for a check, Finn. I'm asking you to get here and verify what I'm seeing. Bring the team. We've got 5 hours to prevent disaster, and I need people who know what they're doing. 5 hours. Boy, even if you're right, even if this is as bad as you think, who's authorizing the work? Who's taking responsibility if you tear into infrastructure and find out it wasn't as urgent as you thought I am? The words came out before Garrett could second-guess them. This is on me. If I'm wrong, if I'm seeing problems that aren't there, I'll eat the cost. But Finn, I'm not wrong. I've seen enough failing systems to know when we're on borrowed time. This one's critical. Another pause. Then the sound of chair legs scraping across concrete as Finn stood. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Rourke and Sullivan, too. But Garrett, you better be right about this. The call ended. Garrett lowered the phone and found the woman still watching him. Her expression had shifted into something he couldn't quite read. Calculation, maybe? Or reassessment? People who lived in penthouses and brokered $80 million deals weren't used to contractors who put their own money on the line for strangers' safety. Mrs. Ashford. He started the sentence without knowing how to finish it. The formal address felt wrong, somehow too distant for someone who'd just chosen 50 families over her career. But he didn't know her first name, didn't know anything about her, except that she made decisions faster than anyone he'd worked for, and apparently valued integrity enough to sacrifice for it. She waved away whatever he'd been about to say. Kate, if we're going to spend the next 5 hours preventing disasters together, you might as well call me Kate. The informality felt like crossing a line he hadn't known existed. In his experience, wealthy clients maintained distance, reminded him through subtle and not so subtle means that they signed the checks and he performed the labor. First names suggested equality partnership, something other than the transactional relationship that kept his business afloat and Hazel fed. Kate nodded toward the destroyed office water, still spreading across floors that probably cost more per square foot than his entire workshop. What happens now? Now I assess the full extent of the damage while we wait for my team. You might want to change clothes. The work ahead isn't going to be pretty, and that suit costs more than my truck. She glanced down at her vest as if just remembering she was still dressed for corporate warfare. I'll be right back. The 2 decades between 1985 construction standards and 2024 building codes told a story Garrett had read too many times. Developers cutting corners, inspectors approving work that met minimums without asking if minimums were enough, residents trusting that someone somewhere had prioritized safety over profit. The electrical system showed the same neglect as the plumbing wires fraying inside walls that concealed evidence until failure became catastrophic. He photographed everything. Documentation mattered when someone inevitably questioned his judgment when lawyers got involved, because lawyers always got involved where money and liability intersected. The camera on his phone captured junction boxes that violated current code pipe joints that had been patch repaired so many times the original installation was barely visible, insulation that had degraded past any reasonable safety margin. Kate returned wearing jeans that looked new enough to still carry store creases and an MIT sweatshirt that had seen better decades. The transformation was startling. Without the armor of expensive tailoring, she looked younger, more accessible, like someone who might have once known what it felt like to worry about rent instead of mergers. She carried 2 mugs of coffee steam rising in the cold air that flowed through the broken window. I figured you could use this. Fair warning, I'm not great at coffee. The machine mostly runs on default settings and hope. Garrett accepted the mug warmth seeping into hands that had gone numb from working in water-soaked conditions. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and probably violated several Geneva Convention articles, but it was hot and caffeinated and offered with the kind of practical kindness he'd stopped expecting from clients. Thank you. He took a sip and managed not to grimace. This is, something terrible. She smiled slightly, the first real expression he'd seen from her that didn't look performed. I know. Preston always said my coffee could double as industrial solvent. But it's 3 in the morning and we're preventing disasters. Standards can slide. The mention of Preston came with weight Garrett recognized. The way people carried names that used to mean one thing and now meant something complicated. He didn't pry. Other people's marriages and divorces weren't his concern, and he'd learned the hard way that asking about wedding rings that disappeared invited conversations he wasn't equipped to handle. Instead, he showed her the photographs on his phone and explaining what each image revealed about deferred maintenance and structural compromise. She listened with the kind of attention that suggested she actually cared about the answer, asking questions that showed intelligence beyond boardroom strategy. So the whole block shares this infrastructure. Her finger traced connections on the screen, following pipes and wires through walls and between buildings. And if one part fails, the cascade effect could take out everything. Exactly. It's cheaper to build connected systems, especially in dense urban development. But it means one weak point becomes everyone's problem. The contractor who built this probably saved a fortune on materials by consolidating. Residents save on individual maintenance costs. But when something breaks, the repair has to address the whole system, or it's just delaying the inevitable. She was quiet for a moment, processing implications that went beyond her flooded office. How many other buildings are like this? In Boston, I mean. How much infrastructure is one disaster away from catastrophic failure? More than you want to know about. Garrett returned his phone to his pocket. Most cities are running on systems installed decades ago, maintained just enough to meet code patched when problems surface, but rarely fixed at the root level. It works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, people die. The bluntness of that final statement hung between them. Kate's expression shifted through several emotions Garrett couldn't quite track. Fear, maybe, or anger, or the kind of helpless frustration that came from realizing the systems you trusted were held together with the equivalent of hope and duct tape. Her phone buzzed again. 52 missed calls now. She glanced at the screen and her jaw tightened. I should let them know I won't make the meeting. You sure it wasn't too late for her to change her mind? Garrett could still do the patch job, get her to that boardroom with time to spare. The question was, test and temptation, wrapped in 6 words. She met his eyes. I'm sure. Because this matters more than that contract, and if the board can't understand why safety takes priority, I'm working for the wrong company. The team arrived at 3:47 with the efficiency of people who'd been working together long enough that coordination didn't require discussion. Finn emerged from his truck, first 67 years, carried in a frame that had shrunk slightly, but still moved with the confidence of someone who'd solved every problem his trade could throw at him. Behind him came Rourke and Sullivan, younger men, who'd learned the same lessons Garrett had about the difference between doing things fast and doing things right. Finn's assessment took 20 minutes and confirmed everything Garrett had suspected. The old man's face grew grimmer with each junction box he opened, each pipe joint he examined. When he finished, he pulled Garrett aside while Kate directed Rourke and Sullivan to the building's maintenance closet. This is worse than you said. Finn kept his voice low, but the anger underneath was clear. This building should have been condemned years ago. The electrical alone is a fire waiting for an excuse. Add in the plumbing issues, and you've got a disaster that's already started, just moving too slow for anyone to notice until it's catastrophic. Can we fix it? In 5 hours, we can prevent immediate failure, stabilize the critical points, shore up the worst of it. But a real fix, Garrett, you are looking at weeks of work. Permits, inspections, bringing everything up to current code. This isn't a patch job. This is a complete system overhaul. The numbers Finn quoted made Garrett's stomach turn. $500,000, 6 weeks of labor, displacing residents while the work got done. The kind of project that required planning and permits and approvals from building management and city inspectors and a dozen other people who'd have opinions about process and timeline and cost. But none of that mattered for the next 5 hours. Right now, they just had to prevent 50 families from waking up to disaster. The work settled into rhythm. Garrett and his team moved through the building's mechanical spaces with practiced coordination, each person knowing their role well enough that communication happened through gesture and shared understanding rather than wasted words. Kate stayed, which surprised him more than it should have. Wealthy clients didn't typically stick around while contractors worked. They wrote checks and disappeared, trusting that hired help would handle things without requiring supervision. But Kate wasn't supervising. She'd found a clipboard and started documenting everything, creating an inventory of components that needed replacement, taking notes when Finn explained what each repair addressed. She asked questions that showed genuine interest in understanding rather than the performance of interest that some clients affected when they wanted to seem engaged. Around 4:30, Garrett found her sitting on the floor in the building's basement mechanical room, surrounded by pipes and electrical panels, making diagrams that mapped the infrastructure they were racing to stabilize. She'd rolled up her sweatshirt sleeves despite the cold hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started neat and devolved into something more chaotic. Somewhere between the penthouse and the basement, she'd stopped being the CFO who brokered $80 million deals and become someone who looked almost comfortable in spaces where work got done with tools instead of PowerPoint. Finn appeared at Garrett's shoulder, watching Kate with the same curiosity Garrett felt. In 40 years doing this, I've never seen a client sit on a basement floor at 4 in the morning taking notes on pipe specifications. She's not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who'd write a check and disappear. Someone who'd complain about the mess and the inconvenience and how we're disrupting her life. Finn pulled a wrench from his belt and handed it to Garrett. Instead, we've got someone who actually cares about why we're doing this instead of just that we're doing it. Kate looked up and caught them watching. Something wrong? Garrett shook his head. Just surprised you're still here. Most clients would have gone back to bed by now. She stood brushing dust from jeans that would probably never fully recover from this experience. I'm not most clients, and this is my building. Well, not mine personally, but I live here. If the infrastructure is failing, I need to understand what that means. Not just for my unit, but for everyone who trusted that their homes were safe. The sincerity in her voice was the kind that couldn't be manufactured. Garrett had met enough people who performed concern to know the difference. Kate wasn't performing. She was genuinely worried about 50 families she'd probably never met, people who existed as abstract neighbors rather than actual connections. The empathy suggested something about her character that penthouses and expensive suits had obscured. Finn cleared his throat, the sound carrying decades of social cues Garrett had learned to interpret. The old man was about to say something that mattered, the kind of observation that came from experience rather than speculation. Boss lady, here's different. You can tell the measure of people by what they do when nobody's watching. When there's no benefit to doing right except knowing you did right. Most folks with money, they do good when it serves them. When it looks good on their reputation, or gets them tax benefits, or makes them feel charitable. But sitting on a cold floor in a basement at 4 in the morning, documenting pipe specifications, that's not performance. That's actual caring. Kate's expression shifted surprise, mixing with something that might have been gratitude. I grew up in a trailer park in Oklahoma. Single-wide, rusted skirting roof that leaked every time it rained. I know what it's like when infrastructure fails and landlords don't care because the people affected can't afford to complain. I got out of that trailer because scholarships and luck and working 3 jobs through college. But I remember what it felt like to go to bed wondering if the electrical would start a fire, if the pipes would freeze and burst, if the people who owned the property cared more about profit margins than safety. The revelation hung in the mechanical room's stale air. Garrett processed the distance between trailer parks and penthouses, between poverty and CFO salaries, between someone who'd escaped circumstance and someone who apparently still remembered where she came from. So when you talk about 50 families trusting their homes are safe, I hear you. Because I was one of those families once. And nobody with power gave a damn whether we lived or died as long as the rent checks cleared. Her voice had gone quiet, not quite vulnerable, but closer to honest than professional relationships typically allowed. I can't fix every broken system, but I can make sure this building doesn't fail the people trusting it. That's worth more than any merger. The quote-worthy line landed with the kind of weight Garrett associated with moments that changed things. Not dramatic changes, not the kind that showed up in movies with swelling orchestras, just the quiet recalibration that happened when someone revealed themselves as more than the assumptions surrounding them suggested. Finn nodded slowly, her respect evident in the gesture. Well then, let's make sure we do this right. The work continued. Rourke and Sullivan moved through the building's upper floors, stabilizing electrical panels and replacing the most compromised sections of wiring. Garrett focused on the plumbing, working alongside Finn to shore up joints that had been failing slowly for years. Kate stayed in motion, bringing coffee that got progressively less terrible as she figured out the machine's settings, making calls to building management, and her assistant Margaret about emergency meetings and rescheduled mergers and damage control that would be required when the board discovered their CFO had chosen infrastructure over immediate profit. Around 6:30, when the work had reached a point where immediate disaster was prevented, if not resolved, Kate's phone rang with a call she couldn't ignore. She stepped into the hallway, and Garrett heard her voice shift into the professional register she'd abandoned hours ago. Yes, I understand the board is concerned. Yes, I know we had a meeting scheduled. No, I couldn't attend because there was a structural emergency that required immediate attention. The conversation continued, Kate's side growing more clipped, as whoever was on the other end apparently questioned her priorities. Garrett tried not to eavesdrop, but the mechanical room's acoustics made privacy impossible. I'm not discussing this further right now. I made the decision I felt was correct, and if the board wants to revisit my judgment, we can have that conversation during regular business hours. Right now, I have 50 families depending on me to make sure their homes don't burn down or flood. That takes priority over everything else. She ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment, shoulders tight with tension that hadn't been there earlier. When she returned to the mechanical room, the mask of control had settled back over her features, but Garrett could see cracks in the performance. Everything okay? Not really. The board is unhappy. That's the diplomatic word. The accurate word is furious. Apparently, sacrificing an $80 million merger to fix infrastructure makes me unreliable and emotionally compromised in a dozen other things that translate to woman making decisions based on feelings instead of logic. Garrett felt anger spike through his exhaustion. Except it wasn't feelings. It was ethics. You prevented a disaster. They don't see it that way. They see a CFO who skipped a critical meeting because of plumbing. Her laugh carried bitterness Garrett recognized from his own encounters with people who valued optics over substance. And maybe they're right. Maybe I did choose wrong. Maybe $80 million could have prevented more disasters than one building's infrastructure repair. Maybe I'm terrible at cost-benefit analysis when actual people are involved instead of abstract numbers on spreadsheets. The vulnerability in that admission struck Garrett as more honest than anything else Kate had said. He set down the pipe wrench he'd been holding and turned to face her fully. You want to know what I think? Not particularly, but I suspect you're going to tell me anyway. The attempted humor fell flat. I think you made a choice that lets you sleep at night. You could have taken the fast option, patched things enough to get through your meeting, collected your merger, and let the problems become someone else's responsibility down the line. Instead, you chose to address the root cause even though it cost you. That's not poor judgment. That's integrity. And if your board can't recognize the difference, you're working for people who don't deserve you. She stared at him for a long moment. Garrett couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if his words had helped or made things worse. Then she did something unexpected. She started crying. Not the dramatic sobbing he associated with grief or loss, but silent tears that tracked down her face while her body remained rigid, like she'd learned long ago that showing emotion was dangerous but couldn't quite control the physical response anymore. Garrett stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. Comforting crying clients wasn't part of his job description, and the few times he tried to offer consolation in the past had ended awkwardly enough that he'd learned silence was usually safer. But something about Kate's silent tears felt different, more desperate, like she'd been holding things together so long that this small crack threatened to become a chasm. I'm sorry, the words came out rough, unpracticed. He grabbed a clean shop towel from his toolbox and held it out, the gesture clumsy but sincere. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to make things worse. She took the towel and pressed it against her eyes, shoulders shaking slightly. You didn't. It's not. This isn't about what you said. It's everything. The merger, the board, Preston, the custody battle, the constant feeling that I'm failing at everything that actually matters while succeeding at things that don't matter at all. The mention of custody battle hit Garrett like a physical blow. He knew that particular hell intimately, the terror of lawyers in courts and other people deciding if you were adequate to parent the child you'd do anything to protect. After Natalie died, distant family members had suggested maybe Hazel would be better off with relatives who could provide stability, two-parent homes, mothers who understood little girls better than widowed fathers ever could. The investigations and evaluations and interviews had stretched for months, every moment colored by the fear that some social worker would decide his love wasn't enough to compensate for his circumstances. You're fighting for custody. He kept his voice carefully neutral, not wanting to push if she didn't want to share, but offering the opening if she did. Kate lowered the towel, eyes red, but expression hardening back toward control. My ex-husband filed 3 months ago. He thinks I'm an unfit mother because I work too much, care more about my career than my son can't provide the emotional stability an 8-year-old needs. And he's not entirely wrong. I'm terrible at motherhood. I don't know how to connect with Liam, don't know how to be present instead of preoccupied, don't know how to give him what he needs instead of what I think he should want. The honesty was raw enough that Garrett felt like he was intruding just by hearing it. But Kate didn't stop, the words coming faster, as if a dam had broken, and everything she'd been holding back suddenly demanded release. Preston's a corporate attorney. He knows exactly what to say and how to present evidence that makes me look negligent. He has photos of school events. I missed documentation of every time I was late for pickup, testimony from Liam's teachers about how I'm never available for conferences. And the worst part, it's all true. I am those things. I do miss events and show up late and prioritize work over my son Because work is something I understand, and motherhood is this impossible thing I keep failing at no matter how hard I try. Her voice cracked on the last word. Garrett watched her fight for composure and lose tears, returning with the kind of helplessness that came from exhaustion and accumulated stress, and the particular despair of feeling inadequate at the things that should matter most. "How old's your daughter?" Kate asked suddenly, voice thick with tears she was still trying to control. "6, Hazel. She'll be 7 in May, and you do it alone, since your wife, 2 years now." Garrett found himself sitting down on the floor across from Kate, the cold concrete seeping through his jeans. The first year was survival. Learning how to braid hair from YouTube videos at 2 in the morning when Hazel woke up crying about her mom. Figuring out which foods didn't require actual cooking skills, because my culinary expertise stops at scrambled eggs. Managing nightmares and grief counseling, and trying to be both parents when I barely knew how to be one. Does it get easier? The question carried such desperate hope that Garrett wished he could offer comfort. But lying seemed worse than honesty, even when honesty hurt. "No, but you get better at it. You learn what matters and what doesn't. You stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be present. You accept that some days you are going to fail, and failing doesn't make you a bad parent as long as you keep trying." Kate wiped her eyes again, mascara smudged, but expression slightly less devastated. "Preston says I don't try. That I hide behind work because motherhood is hard, and I'm not equipped for hard things that don't have clear metrics for success. That's manipulation." Garrett spoke with more force than he intended. People who want to hurt you find your weakest points and press until you break. Doesn't make what they're saying true, just makes them effective at finding where you're vulnerable. She looked at him with something approaching gratitude. "You don't even know me. How can you be so certain I'm not as terrible as Preston claims? Because terrible parents don't sit on basement floors at 6 in the morning worrying about 50 families they've never met. Terrible parents don't sacrifice $80 million mergers to prevent disasters that don't directly affect them. Terrible parents don't cry about feeling inadequate because terrible parents don't care enough to feel inadequate in the first place." The words settled between them, simple truth without decoration. Kate's expression shifted through several emotions Garrett couldn't quite track before landing on something that might have been hope mixed with resignation. "The hearing's in February. Preston's pushing for full custody. My lawyer says I need to demonstrate change behavior, prove I can prioritize Liam over work, show the court I'm capable of being the mother he deserves instead of the mother I've been." She laughed without humor. "Which sounds simple, except I don't know how to be different than I am. Work is what I understand. Spreadsheets and profit margins and strategic planning make sense. 8-year-old boys who want mothers to actually show up for them, I have no idea how to succeed at that." Garrett stood and offered his hand to help her up. The gesture was automatic, ingrained courtesy from a lifetime of opening doors and carrying heavy things and treating people with respect, regardless of whether they signed his paychecks. Kate accepted the help, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who'd just fallen apart. "You asked if it gets easier. It doesn't. But you do get better at asking for help, at admitting you don't know everything and learning from people who do. I had to swallow a lot of pride those first months, calling my mother-in-law at midnight because Hazel had a fever, and I didn't know if emergency rooms were necessary or overreacting. Accepting that being a good father meant being humble enough to learn from anyone who could teach me, even when it bruised my ego to admit I needed teaching." Kate studied him with an intensity that made Garrett uncomfortable. He'd revealed more in the last 10 minutes than he typically shared with anyone outside Finn and Hazel, and the vulnerability of exposure left him feeling raw in ways he'd spent 2 years avoiding. "Would you teach me?" The question came out quiet, almost tentative, not through some formal arrangement or paid consulting, just, "Would you help me figure out how to be better at this? How to prioritize my son without destroying my career? How to be present instead of preoccupied?" The request hung in the air between them. Garrett's first instinct was refusal, self-preservation, screaming that getting involved in other people's family disasters invited complications he didn't need. He had his own life to manage, his own daughter, to raise his own grief, to process without taking on someone else's struggles. But Kate was looking at him with an expression that reminded him of Hazel in those first terrible months after Natalie died, when his daughter had needed reassurance that adults could be trusted to help even when helping was hard. The word yes was forming before Garrett fully processed what he was agreeing to. But something about Kate's desperate honesty about her willingness to admit failure and ask for help despite the pride it must cost someone who'd climbed from trailer parks to CFO positions demanded response. Before he could commit himself to something he hadn't fully thought through, Finn's voice carried from the doorway. Garrett, we're at a stopping point. Immediate crisis averted. Building's not going to burn down or flood today, but we need to talk about next steps because this is bigger than a 5-hour emergency repair. Kate straightened, wiping the last evidence of tears from her face and rebuilding the professional mask with visible effort. Right, yes. What do you need? The conversation shifted to logistics and costs and timelines for addressing infrastructure that had been neglected for decades. Garrett watched Kate transform back into the CFO who made decisions about millions of dollars with confidence he'd only glimpsed earlier. She pulled out her phone and started coordinating building management and insurance adjusters and emergency contractors, voice steady despite the emotional breakdown minutes earlier. By 7:43, the immediate work was complete, and Garrett's team was packing tools with the efficiency of people who wanted nothing more than breakfast and sleep. Kate walked them to the parking garage, still wearing jeans and the MIT sweatshirt that had gotten progressively dirtier as the night progressed. She stopped beside Garrett's truck, an ancient Ford that had survived 200,000 miles through optimism and regular maintenance rather than any inherent reliability. What do I owe you for tonight's work? Garrett did quick math on hours and materials. 3,000. That's for the emergency stabilization. The full repair is going to be significantly more, but we'll need to coordinate with building management on scope and timeline. Kate pulled out her phone and made the transfer without hesitation. The notification of payment arrived on Garrett's phone seconds later. $3,000 that would cover Hazel's overdue dental work and the truck's increasingly concerning transmission issues. Thank you. For tonight. For everything. Kate's formality had returned professional distance, reasserting itself now that the crisis had passed. I meant what I said earlier, about wanting help figuring out how to be better at motherhood. I know that's not a normal request to make of your contractor, but it's fine. The words came out before Garrett could reconsider. I'll help if I can. I don't have any credentials or formal training, just experience figuring things out the hard way. But if that's useful to you, I'm willing to try. Relief crossed Kate's features, visible even through the exhaustion and stress that lined her face. Thank you, I'll call you. Once I figure out how to explain to the board why I just cost them $80 million in the name of ethics, they're lucky to have you, whether they know it or not. Garrett climbed into his truck key, turning in an ignition that protested the early hour but ultimately cooperated. He watched Kate walk back toward the building in his rearview mirror, shoulders squared despite the destroyed merger and angry board and custody battle that waited for her inside. The sunrise was turning Boston's skyline orange and gold light, reflecting off glass towers that housed people whose problems Garrett would never fully understand. His phone buzzed with a text from Finn. That woman's trouble. The good kind maybe, but still trouble. You sure you want to get involved? Garrett stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Too late, already involved. The drive back to Dorchester took 40 minutes through morning traffic beginning to clog highways with commuters who assumed infrastructure held because it always had. Garrett thought about Kate sitting on basement floors and crying silently and asking for help with the kind of humility that came from genuine desperation rather than performed vulnerability. He thought about 50 families sleeping soundly because someone had chosen ethics over expedience, safety over profit, right over easy. And he thought about the question Kate had asked with such desperate hope. Does it get easier? No. He'd told her, but you get better at it. The truth applied to more than just parenting, to grief and loss and the slow construction of life after everything fell apart, to helping people who needed help even when helping complicated your own carefully managed existence. Garrett pulled into his workshop's parking lot as his phone buzzed again. This time the message was from Kate, board meeting at 9. Wish me luck. And thank you again for teaching me that some things matter more than mergers. He typed a response and deleted it 3 times before settling on simple honesty. You don't need luck. You need to remember who you are when nobody's watching. That person is stronger than your board gives you credit for. The sun had fully risen by the time Garrett unlocked his workshop door, exhausted, but strangely hopeful in ways he hadn't felt since Natalie died. Change was coming, the kind he couldn't quite predict, but somehow knew mattered. Inside the workshop, plans waited for him, not just for infrastructure repair, but for something more complicated and potentially more important. Teaching someone to be a better parent required skills he'd barely mastered himself. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best teachers were people who understood struggle intimately, who could offer empathy instead of expertise, presence instead of perfection. His phone buzzed one final time. Another message from Kate. If your offer to help is genuine, I'd like to take you up on it, not as contractor and client, as two people trying to do better for the children depending on them. Let me know what that would look like. Garrett stared at the message, considering implications and complications, and the fundamental disruption this would bring to the careful boundaries he'd built around his life. Then he thought about Hazel and the village of people who'd helped him learn to be the father she needed. Finn teaching him patience, his mother-in-law teaching him braiding, the kindergarten teacher who gently corrected his approach to behavioral issues with wisdom earned through decades of experience. Nobody did this alone, not successfully, not in ways that mattered. His response was simple. Come to my workshop Wednesday at 6. Bring your son. Whilst Wednesday arrived with the kind of November cold that made Boston feel like a city built on spite and historical significance rather than any consideration for human comfort. Garrett's workshop occupied a converted garage in Dorchester, the kind of neighborhood where property values meant families could still afford to live within commuting distance of jobs that actually paid. The space smelled like motor oil and copper wire, decades of repairs, leaving their scent embedded in concrete floors that had absorbed more sweat than most gyms. Hazel sat in her designated corner, a space Garrett had carved out with cushions and a folding table that served as homework station and art studio, depending on the day. She was working on multiplication tables with the kind of focused determination she'd inherited from Natalie, tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on problems that seemed designed to torture 6-year-olds who just wanted to play. The Mercedes arrived at 6:03, precision timing that suggested Kate had circled the block to avoid being early. Garrett watched through the workshop's front window as she emerged from the driver's seat, followed by a boy who moved with the careful neutrality of children who had learned emotional displays invited unwanted attention. Liam Ashford was small for 8, dark hair, and serious eyes that tracked his surroundings with assessment beyond his years. Hazel looked up from her multiplication tables as the workshop door opened, curiosity replacing concentration. She'd asked 3 times since Monday who was visiting, and why each question met with Garrett's careful explanation that sometimes adults needed help learning things just like kids did. The answer had satisfied her in the way that children accepted adult strangeness when it didn't directly affect their lives. Kate had dressed down again, jeans and a sweater that looked expensive despite the casual cut. But her movements carried tension that hadn't been present in the basement during infrastructure crisis. Uncertainty replacing the confidence that came from managing disasters with clear parameters. Liam stayed close to her side, one hand gripping the edge of her jacket like an anchor. Garrett wiped his hands on the shop towel that lived permanently in his back pocket. The gesture was automatic, years of meeting clients, leaving him hyper-aware of grease-stained fingers and the particular judgment that came from people who worked with their hands, encountering people who didn't. Thanks for coming. I know this isn't exactly convenient. Kate's smile carried gratitude mixed with nervousness. Convenience stopped being the priority when I realized I was failing at the most important job I'll ever have. She glanced down at Liam, who was staring at the workshop's tools with the kind of fascination boys his age reserve for things that looked potentially dangerous. This is Liam. Liam, this is Mr. Holloway and his daughter Hazel. The formality felt wrong for what Garrett was trying to accomplish. Kids don't learn connection through formal introductions. Just Garrett's fine. And that's Hazel over there pretending multiplication tables are interesting when we both know they're torture. Hazel looked up with the kind of relief that came from adult permission to abandon homework. They're the worst. Why do I need to know what 7 times 8 is? Nobody actually uses that in real life. Liam's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his careful neutrality. My teacher says the same thing, that we'll use it when we're older. But I think adults just make stuff up to make us do boring things. Conspiracy theories about adult manipulation. Garrett suppressed a smile. Always a solid foundation for childhood philosophy. You're probably right. Most of what they teach you in 2nd grade is useless. But sometimes you learn useful things by accident while doing the boring stuff. That's how school tricks you. The observation earned a slight smile from Liam, the expression transforming his serious face into something more age-appropriate. Kate was watching the interaction with intensity that suggested she was taking mental notes, trying to reverse engineer whatever magic made children respond when formal parenting approaches failed. Hazel abandoned her homework entirely and crossed the workshop to stand in front of Liam with the kind of direct assessment children employed before social conditioning taught them subtlety. "Do you like to build things?" Liam's uncertainty returned. "I don't know. I've never really tried." The admission seemed to pain him, like confessing ignorance revealed some fundamental inadequacy. Hazel didn't notice or didn't care, already moving toward the workbench where Garrett kept kids-safe projects. "We're building a birdhouse. Dad says it's important to learn how things fit together because everything is just pieces that connect. Want to help?" The invitation was casual, stripped of pressure or expectation. Liam looked to Kate for permission, the gesture so automatic it revealed volumes about their relationship. She nodded encouragement, mixed with something that might have been longing, watching her son engage with another child in ways that apparently didn't happen often enough. Garrett gestured toward his office, a space that was generous in name only, really just a corner partitioned off with drywall and optimism. "We should talk while they work. Give them space to figure things out without us hovering." Kate followed him into the cramped office, taking in the metal desk covered in invoices and the filing cabinet that had given up on organization years ago. The walls displayed Hazel's artwork alongside business licenses and insurance certificates, crayon drawings of families and houses, sharing space with documentation that Holloway Systems Repair operated legally and with appropriate permits. She sat in the plastic chair Garrett kept for clients' posture straight, despite the informal setting. "I've been thinking about what you said, about asking for help and learning from people who know what they're doing. And I realized I don't actually know what I'm asking for. I need to be a better mother, but I don't know what that looks like beyond abstract concepts like being present and prioritizing my son." Garrett leaned against the desk, the position less authoritative than sitting behind it like this was a business transaction. "What does a normal evening look like for you and Liam?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Normal, yeah. You get home from work, then what? Walk me through the routine." Kate's expression shifted through calculation, like she was trying to determine the right answer to a test question. "I usually get home around 7, sometimes 8 if there are late meetings. Liam's nanny has already fed him dinner, helped with homework. I check in, ask about his day. He gives one-word answers. I review his homework, make sure everything's complete and correct. Then he goes to his room to read or play video games. I work for another few hours. We don't really interact much beyond the homework check-in." The clinical description explained more than Kate probably intended. Garrett thought about his own evenings with Hazel, the chaos of cooking together and bath time negotiations, and the elaborate bedtime routine that stretched 30 minutes into an hour because his daughter had inherited her mother's gift for creative stalling. "What does Liam like to do? I don't know." Kate's voice had gone quiet, admission costing her visible effort. "He plays video games, reads sometimes. The school says he's good at art, but I've never actually seen him draw. I don't know what he enjoys because I've never asked in ways that got real answers instead of the responses he thinks I want to hear." The honesty was stark enough that Garrett felt like an intruder, but this was what she'd asked for, help that required vulnerability even when vulnerability was uncomfortable. "Start there then. Figure out what he likes. Not what you think he should like or what looks good on college applications, but what actually brings him joy. Then do those things with him, not as supervisor or quality control, but as someone genuinely interested in his world." Kate pulled out her phone and started typing notes, the gesture so automatic it revealed how she processed information. "Turn everything into data, analyze and optimize. But you can't optimize connection. It doesn't work that way." She lowered the phone, awareness crossing her features. "Right. Sorry. That's part of the problem, isn't it? I approach parenting like a business problem. Find the metrics, identify the gaps, implement solutions. But Liam's not a quarterly report." "No. But you're also not completely wrong." Garrett pushed off from the desk and moved to the small window that overlooked the workspace where Hazel was showing Liam how to measure and mark wood for cutting. "Parenting has patterns you can learn, routines that help. Consistency matters, but it's not about perfection or hitting targets." It's about showing up even when you don't know what you're doing and being willing to fail in front of your kid while you figure it out together. That sounds terrifying. It is, every single day. The fear that you're screwing up in ways that will require therapy to fix. The knowledge that you're going to fail and that failure affects someone who didn't choose to have you as a parent, just got stuck with whatever you are. But Hazel taught me something after Natalie died. Kids don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones who admit when they're wrong and keep trying anyway. Kate was quiet for a long moment, watching Liam through the window. He was actually smiling now, engaged with the birdhouse project in ways that made him look younger and less guarded. I want to hire you. The words came out formal despite the informal setting. Not as a contractor, as a consultant, a parenting consultant. I'll pay you $5,000 a month for 3 months. You teach me how to connect with my son, how to be present instead of preoccupied, how to be the mother he deserves instead of the mother I've been. The proposal hung in the cramped office like smoke visible and suffocating. Garrett felt his chest tighten with familiar anger, the kind that came from people who thought money solved everything. You want to hire me to teach you how to be a mother? Yeah. Kate's directness didn't waver. I know how that sounds. Like I'm trying to buy something that can't be purchased. But I'm not asking you to sell your integrity. I'm asking you to share your expertise. You're good at this. I'm terrible at it. That's not different from hiring any other kind of teacher or consultant. I just happen to be paying you to teach me about the most important thing in my life, instead of spreadsheets or strategic planning. It's completely different. Garrett's voice had gone hard despite his attempt at control. Teaching someone financial analysis doesn't require them to change who they are fundamentally. You're not asking me to teach you skills. You're asking me to teach you how to love your son differently. That's not something you can put a price tag on and expect to purchase like hiring a tutor. Then don't charge me. Kate stood meeting his anger with desperation. Do it for free if money makes it feel transactional. Do it because you have information I need, and I'm humble enough to admit I need it. Do it because a father who actually knows what he's doing might be able to prevent a mother from losing custody of her son to a man who's using that son as a weapon in a divorce battle. The mention of custody shifted something in Garrett's anger. He knew that particular fear too intimately to dismiss it as manipulation. After Natalie died, the evaluation period when social workers had assessed his fitness as a single parent had been the worst 6 months of his life. Every parenting decision, scrutinized every mistake, documented every moment of overwhelm, potentially used as evidence that Hazel would be better off elsewhere. Your ex is really pushing for full custody. February hearing. Kate's control cracked slightly, vulnerability bleeding through professional composure. His lawyers are building a case that I'm emotionally unavailable, career-obsessed, incapable of prioritizing my son's needs over corporate advancement. They have documentation going back 2 years. Every missed school event, every late pickup, every parent-teacher conference I sent my assistant to instead of attending myself. It's all true. I was all those things. But I'm trying to change, and I don't know how to demonstrate that change to a court that's going to judge me based on patterns I've spent 8 years establishing. So you think hiring me makes you look better? Shows you're taking parenting seriously. I think learning from someone who actually knows what they're doing is better than continuing to fail in the same ways while hoping for different results. Kate's voice had gone quiet again. Whether that makes me look better to the court is secondary to whether it actually makes me a better mother. But yes, I need evidence of changed behavior. I need to show I'm capable of growth. Hiring a parenting consultant demonstrates I'm taking this seriously even if it costs me. The calculation made sense from a legal strategy perspective, but it also revealed the transactional thinking Garrett was trying to address. You can't fix this with strategy and documentation. Courts don't just want evidence of effort. They want genuine change, real connection with your kid that comes from actually caring, not from hiring someone to teach you how to perform caring. Then help me learn to actually care. Kate's desperation was raw enough that Garrett felt like he was watching someone drown in real time. I know that sounds terrible. Like I'm admitting I don't love my son, but it's not that I don't love him. It's that I don't know how to show love in ways that matter to him. I love him like I love spreadsheets and strategic plans with analysis and optimization and constant improvement. But 8-year-old boys don't need their mothers to optimize their lives. They need mothers who show up and pay attention and give a damn about the things that matter to them, even when those things seem trivial to adult concerns. The admission cost her visible in the way her shoulders tensed and her hands gripped the edge of the desk. Garrett's anger ebbed, replaced by something uncomfortably close to empathy. He thought about the first months after Natalie died, when he'd loved Hazel desperately, but had no idea how to translate that love into the kind of parenting she needed. When he'd fed her and kept her clean and made sure homework got done while completely missing that she needed him to be emotionally present instead of just physically available. The money bothers me. He kept his voice level, trying to articulate discomfort he didn't fully understand himself. Taking $5,000 a month to teach you how to parent feels like I'm selling something that should be freely shared, like I'm profiting from your desperation. Then name a different price, whatever you're comfortable with. Kate pulled out her phone again, the gesture automatic. Or don't charge me at all. Whatever makes this feel less like a transaction and more like genuine help. Garrett thought about Hazel's dental work still unpaid because insurance covered half and payment plans didn't eliminate debt so much as spread it out. Thought about the truck's transmission that was one hard shift away from catastrophic failure. Thought about the workshop's rent that came due every month regardless of whether enough work came in to cover it. $3,000. The compromise emerged before he'd fully processed the implications. $3,000 a month for 3 months. But there are conditions. You do exactly what I tell you about parenting. No arguments about how you don't have time or how work demands conflict with my suggestions. If you agree to this, you commit fully. And the moment you stop following through, the agreement ends, and I keep whatever you've paid to that point. Done. Kate's response was immediate. But I have conditions too. Of course you do. You have to appear at 3 company events with me as a colleague. Preston's going to be at these functions, and he needs to see that I have a life outside work. Relationships that aren't purely professional. You don't have to pretend we're dating. Just that we're friends who enjoy each other's company. The request made sense from a custody perspective. Courts looked favorably on parents who had social connections, support systems that extended beyond work relationships. But it also meant Garrett would be performing for lawyers and judges, and an ex-husband who apparently excelled at making people look bad. What kind of events? Corporate galas, mostly. Technova does quarterly celebration dinners, charity fundraisers, networking functions. The next one's in 2 weeks. Black tie. You'd need a suit. Garrett thought about his closet, the single suit he owned, purchased for Natalie's funeral, and worn exactly once since. I have a suit. Good. And you need to meet with Liam twice a week. Teach him practical skills like you're teaching Hazel. How to fix things, build things, understand how systems work. Not as formal tutoring, but as mentorship. The kind of male presence Preston claims I'm denying him by not remarrying. That's manipulative. Everything about custody battles is manipulative. Kate's voice carried bitterness earned through experience. Preston's lawyers are painting me as a woman who can't provide masculine influence in Liam's life. Having a mentor relationship with someone like you counters that narrative. Someone like me. Garrett heard the classification the way she'd reduced him to useful categories. Working class man with practical skills and visible competence at fatherhood. The kind of person who looked good in custody evaluations because courts valued traditional masculinity even when traditional masculinity had nothing to do with actual parenting ability. One more condition. He met her eyes directly. Everything we do with Liam happens because it's good for Liam, not because it looks good for your lawyers. I'm not participating in performance parenting where the goal is impressing courts instead of connecting with your kid. If I think you're treating this like theater instead of genuine growth, I'm out. Fair. Kate extended her hand. 3 months. $3,000 a month. I follow your guidance on parenting. You attend 3 events and meet with Liam twice weekly. Full transparency, no games, genuine effort to help me become the mother my son deserves. Garrett looked at her outstretched hand, the gesture so formal it felt absurd given everything they had already shared. But the formality also provided structure boundaries that kept this from becoming something more complicated than an agreement between 2 people trying to help a child who deserved better than the parenting he'd received so far. He shook her hand, her grip firm and surprisingly warm. 3 months, starting now. The first meeting with Liam happened without the pretense of formal instruction. Garrett simply invited the boy to help with the birdhouse project Hazel had abandoned in favor of showing off her collection of rocks that supposedly had special powers. Liam approached the workbench with the kind of careful interest that suggested he'd been taught not to touch things without permission, waiting for explicit invitation before picking up tools or materials. You ever use a measuring tape? Garrett held out the tool, yellow metal case worn from decades of use. Liam shook his head, the gesture small and apologetic. My dad doesn't really do building stuff. He's a lawyer. Lots of lawyers build things. Garrett pulled out wood that had been pre-cut for safety, but still needed measuring for assembly. They just build arguments instead of birdhouses. Same principle, though. Everything has to fit together properly, or the whole structure fails. The comparison seemed to interest Liam. He took the measuring tape with the kind of reverence that suggested this was the first time an adult had trusted him with real tools. The metal tape extended with a satisfying snap, numbers marking increments that probably seemed arbitrary to someone who hadn't yet learned fractions. We need to measure 12 inches from this edge. Garrett pointed to the mark without taking over the task. Can you find 12 on the tape? Liam's tongue poked out slightly as he concentrated the gesture, identical to Hazel's focused face. The similarity reminded Garrett that kids were fundamentally similar, regardless of their parents' tax brackets. They all needed patience and encouragement and the space to figure things out without adults hovering. Is this it? Liam's finger rested on the 12-inch mark, uncertainty making the question more plea than inquiry. Perfect. Now mark it with this pencil so we know where to cut. The next 20 minutes passed in comfortable focus, Liam gradually relaxing as the project demanded attention without requiring emotional vulnerability. Garrett watched the transformation, the way the boy's shoulders loosened, and his movements became less careful as he realized mistakes weren't punished with disappointment or criticism. Kate observed from the office doorway, her presence unobtrusive but constant. Garrett caught her expression during moments when Liam wasn't looking, saw something that might have been grief mixed with longing. She was watching her son engage with an adult in ways that apparently didn't happen between them. Witnessing connection she didn't know how to create herself. When Hazel announced she was hungry with the dramatic urgency children reserve for basic needs, Garrett called a break. Pizza okay with everyone. I was planning to order anyway since cooking after working all day sounds like punishment. Liam looked to Kate for permission again, the automatic deference revealing patterns Garrett would need to address if they were going to make real progress. The boy's entire social vocabulary seemed to route through maternal approval, asking permission for preferences instead of stating wants directly. Kate caught Garrett's look and seemed to understand the unspoken criticism. What kind of pizza do you want, Liam? Not what you think I want you to want, what actually sounds good to you. The question clearly confused the boy. He stared at his mother like she'd started speaking another language. I don't know, whatever you want is fine. Nope, Kate crossed the workshop to kneel in front of her son, the gesture bringing her to his eye level. I want to know what you want. Pepperoni cheese, something weird like pineapple that other people will judge us for ordering? The slight smile that crossed Liam's face transformed his serious expression. I like pepperoni, but also sausage. Can you get pizza with both? Absolutely. Kate pulled out her phone and started placing the order, including Liam in decisions about drinks and side orders, in ways that suggested she was actively trying to implement lessons she'd just learned. The effort was visible enough to be slightly awkward, but Liam seemed to appreciate being consulted rather than having adults make all decisions on his behalf. Garrett ordered from the local place that knew his usual order well enough that the kid who answered recognized his voice. Large pepperoni and sausage, large cheese for Hazel, who'd decided last month that meat was morally complicated. Breadsticks because carbs made everything better. While they waited for delivery, Garrett found himself in the unexpected position of mediating between Hazel and Liam over the birdhouse project. His daughter had apparently decided the design needed modifications that involved significantly more glitter than any bird could possibly appreciate. Liam was defending structural integrity with arguments that suggested he'd inherited his mother's strategic thinking, along with her serious eyes. Birds don't care about glitter. Liam's voice carried conviction despite his general uncertainty. They care about the house being safe and dry. If we put too much stuff on it, the weight distribution gets weird and it might fall. But it looks boring without decoration. Hazel held her ground with the kind of stubborn certainty that made Garrett proud and exhausted in equal measure. Everything's better with glitter. That's just science. That's definitely not science, Waki. Liam's slight smile suggested he was enjoying the debate despite disagreeing with the premise. Science is about testing and evidence. You can't just say glitter makes things better without proving it. The argument continued with the kind of intensity that made Garrett nostalgic for moments before parenting meant constantly negotiating peace treaties between tiny humans with strong opinions. Kate watched from the sidelines, expressions shifting between amusement and something more complex. She was seeing her son engage with another child as an equal, defending positions and expressing preferences instead of the careful neutrality he showed around adults. When the pizza arrived, they ate sitting on the workshop floor because Garrett's office wasn't big enough for 4 people, and the workbenches were covered in projects at various stages of completion. Hazel dominated the conversation with elaborate explanations of her rock collection's magical properties, each stone imbued with powers she'd invented through logic only 6-year-olds could follow. Liam listened with the kind of serious attention that suggested he was genuinely interested rather than just being polite. Kate ate in silence, observing more than participating, but her presence had shifted from the formal distance of earlier to something more relaxed. She tucked her legs under her and was leaning against the wall like someone who'd forgotten to maintain perfect posture, the small surrender revealing exhaustion she usually kept hidden. Garrett's phone buzzed halfway through the second slice of pizza. Finn's name appeared on the screen with a message that managed to be both supportive and judgmental. Heard you took on a consulting job. Please tell me you're not getting in over your head with that rich lady and her problems. The text captured everything Garrett was trying not to think about. The way Kate's presence in his workshop felt simultaneously right and dangerous. How teaching her to parent Liam created complications he hadn't fully considered when he'd agreed to help. The fact that $3,000 a month would solve immediate financial problems, while potentially creating larger issues he couldn't predict. He typed a response and deleted it twice before settling on honesty. Too late to back out now. Already committed. Finn's reply was immediate, famous last words. Watch yourself. After pizza, Kate gathered Liam with the kind of efficient movement that suggested their time together operated on strict schedules. Thank you for tonight, for the lesson and the pizza, and treating Liam like a person instead of a problem to solve. He's not a problem. Garrett walked them to the Mercedes November Cold, making breath visible in the parking lot's inadequate lighting. He's just a kid who needs his mother to see him instead of the version of him she thinks she should be raising. The observation landed somewhere between helpful and accusatory. Kate's expression tightened, but she didn't argue. You're right, I know you're right. I just don't know how to see him clearly when I'm so busy trying to be what the court wants instead of what he needs. Stop thinking about the court. Start thinking about what makes him smile. The rest will follow. Liam climbed into the Mercedes, already absorbed in his phone, with the kind of focus kids use to avoid extended goodbyes. Kate paused with her hand on the driver's door, looking back at Garrett with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. I meant what I said earlier, about being grateful. Most people in your position would have turned me down or charged twice what you were asking or taken advantage of how desperate I am. You're doing none of those things, and I notice. The gratitude felt unearned. Garrett was charging $3,000 a month, an amount that would significantly improve his financial situation, even if it was less than Kate's initial offer. He was hardly operating from pure altruism. I'm helping because I remember what it feels like to need help and not know how to ask for it. Everything else is just details. Kate nodded and climbed into the Mercedes. The engine started with the kind of smooth precision that came from cars that cost more than most people's houses. Garrett watched them drive away, taillights disappearing into Dorchester's evening traffic, and wondered what exactly he had agreed to. Inside the workshop, Hazel had returned to her homework with the resigned determination of someone who'd been promised completion meant freedom. She looked up as Garrett entered, pencil poised over multiplication tables that remained as torturous as when they'd started. Dad, is Liam going to come over a lot now, twice a week probably? Maybe more. I'm helping his mom learn some things about parenting. Hazel processed this with the kind of careful consideration she applied to problems that mattered. Is she bad at being a mom? The question was innocent enough, but loaded with implications Garrett needed to navigate carefully. She's not bad. She's just learning. Like how you're learning multiplication. Some people need more practice than others, and that's okay as long as they keep trying. Okay, Hazel returned to her homework, the explanation apparently sufficient. But then she looked up again, expression shifting to something more serious. Liam seems sad, like he's pretending he's okay, but really he's not. The observation caught Garrett off guard. His daughter had inherited Natalie's ability to read emotional undercurrents, seeing things adults missed because they were too busy managing their own concerns. You're probably right. His parents are getting divorced, and that's hard on kids, even when the adults try to make it easier. Like when Mom died, Hazel's voice had gone quiet. How you were sad but pretended you weren't because you thought I needed you to be strong. The parallel was more accurate than Garrett wanted to admit. Yeah, kind of like that. You should tell Liam's mom that pretending doesn't help, that it's better when adults are honest about being sad or scared because then kids know it's okay to feel those things too. The wisdom from a 6-year-old was humbling. Garrett crossed the workshop to pull Hazel into a hug, her small body fitting against his chest, with the kind of perfect geometry that made parenthood feel less impossible. When did you get so smart about feelings I learned from you? When you stopped pretending and started telling me the truth about missing Mom. That's when I felt better. Not happy, but better. Like it was okay to be sad as long as we were sad together. Garrett held his daughter and thought about Kate's performance of competence, the way she'd been trying to project strength for Liam while drowning in problems she couldn't solve alone. Maybe honesty was the first lesson worth teaching. Not just tactical parenting advice, but the fundamental truth that vulnerability connected people better than any perfectly executed strategy. The next 2 weeks developed their own rhythm. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Kate brought Liam to the workshop for what Garrett was calling practical skills education, but which really amounted to them working on projects together while Garrett modeled the kind of patient engagement that let kids learn through doing rather than instruction. They built storage shelves for Hazel's room, repaired a neighbor's broken fence, took apart an old radio to understand how components connected. Liam transformed during these sessions. The careful neutrality gave way to genuine curiosity, questions emerging without the filter of wondering if adults would judge him for not knowing. He made mistakes without apologizing, accepted correction without defensiveness, and slowly began to claim space the way children should when they felt safe enough to just be themselves. Kate observed everything, taking mental notes that occasionally translated into actual notes on her phone, until Garrett reminded her that some things couldn't be documented, only experienced. She was trying which counted for more than natural ability ever could. The corporate event arrived with the kind of inevitability that made Garrett wish he'd negotiated better conditions. The Tech Nova quarterly gala occupied the Four Seasons ballroom with the kind of expensive elegance that announced success through understatement rather than excess. Garrett's funeral suit had been dry cleaned for the occasion, the garment hanging in his closet for 2 years, suddenly pressed into service for an evening that promised to be uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with fit. Finn had offered to watch both Hazel and Liam, the old man's workshop, transformed into impromptu childcare center with video games and pizza, and the kind of grandfatherly indulgence that made Garrett grateful for mentors who became family. Hazel had been thrilled at the prospect of teaching Liam about her rock collection's magical properties. Liam had seemed cautiously optimistic about an evening that didn't involve formal dinners or parental tension. Kate picked Garrett up at 7:30, the Mercedes looking only slightly out of place in Dorchester's working-class neighborhood. She'd transformed into the polished version of herself that dominated boardroom's evening gown, making her look like she belonged in ballrooms while Garrett felt like an intruder in borrowed formal wear. "You look nice." She offered the compliment with the kind of careful warmth that suggested she was trying to make him comfortable despite the gulf between their usual contexts. "I look like a contractor in a suit." Garrett climbed into the passenger seat, the Mercedes' leather interior, a stark contrast to his truck's utilitarian vinyl. "But I clean up better than expected, so there's that." The drive into downtown took 30 minutes traffic, cooperating in ways it rarely did. Kate was quiet, the silence carrying tension that suggested she was preparing for performance rather than enjoying an evening out. Garrett didn't try to fill the quiet with conversation. Sometimes people needed space to gather whatever strength the night ahead would require. The Four Seasons was exactly what Garrett expected. All marble and crystal, the kind of space designed to make wealthy people feel validated while everyone else felt inadequate. Valet parking handled the Mercedes with efficiency that suggested expensive cars arrive constantly. Inside the ballroom glittered with light, reflected through chandeliers that probably cost more than Garrett's annual income. Kate's hand found his arm, the gesture automatic but weighted with meaning beyond simple courtesy. People would be watching, judging, assessing whether the CFO who'd sacrificed an $80 million merger had lost her mind or simply gained perspective. Preston would be somewhere in this crowd ready to catalog any evidence that Kate was unstable or making poor decisions. The crowd parted slightly as they entered conversations, pausing just long enough to mark their arrival, before resuming with the particular intensity of people pretending they hadn't been staring. Garrett felt the weight of assessment judgment being passed by people whose opinions shouldn't matter, but somehow did anyway. Kate navigated the social landscape with practiced ease, introducing Garrett to executives and board members whose names he immediately forgot. He shook hands and made appropriate noises, playing the role of colleague, without quite understanding what that meant in contexts where business happened through conversation rather than actual work. Then Preston appeared. The man moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in ways that made him believe it. Tall, expensively tailored, he carried his 45 years with the kind of preserved youth that came from personal trainers and dermatologists and the belief that appearance mattered more than substance. His date was stunning in the way that suggested professional selection, beauty hired for an evening to demonstrate desirability and taste, Catherine. Preston's voice carried across the conversation, smooth and cultured, with undertones that suggested ownership. He'd used her full name deliberately, the formality establishing distance while claiming familiarity. Surprised to see you here? Usually you're too busy for these frivolous social obligations. Kate's grip on Garrett's arm tightened imperceptibly. I've been reevaluating priorities, decided some things are worth making time for. Preston's eyes shifted to Garrett, assessment immediate and dismissive. And this is the question was directed at Kate rather than Garrett, the rudeness casual enough to seem almost accidental. Garrett Holloway, colleague and friend. Kate's introduction was smooth, rehearsed, probably designed to present their relationship as established rather than new. Garrett extended his hand, the gesture forcing Preston into civility. The handshake was what he expected, calculated pressure, designed to establish dominance, held just long enough to make the point. Preston's palm was soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never done physical labor and took pride in that fact. Garrett. Preston drew out the name like he was tasting it, finding it mildly amusing. What is it you do exactly? The question was designed to diminish. Garrett had encountered this particular brand of condescension enough times to recognize the game. Preston wanted him to feel inadequate to perform working-class humility that reinforced social hierarchies. I fix things that are broken, systems mostly, electrical, plumbing, structural issues that could become catastrophic if they're not addressed properly. How very blue-collar. Preston's smile never reached his eyes. So you're a handyman, one of those fellows who makes house calls when the sink backs up. The condescension was deliberate, the insult wrapped in enough civility to maintain plausible deniability. But Garrett had stopped caring about the opinions of people like Preston years ago when Natalie died, and he'd learned that character mattered more than status and integrity counted more than impressive job titles. I'm someone who understands structure, how components fit together, where weak points develop, what happens when systems fail, because someone cut corners or prioritized appearance over function. He kept his voice level, conversational, the tone suggesting he was explaining rather than defending. Most people don't think about infrastructure until it fails. Then they're surprised when buildings flood or catch fire because they trusted that someone somewhere gave a damn about doing things right instead of fast. Preston's expression shifted, calculation, replacing casual dismissal. How philosophical. Though I'm not sure what philosophy has to do with fixing pipes. Kate's hand on Garrett's arm tightened again, either warning or encouragement. But Garrett was done playing games with men who measured worth through wealth and judged competence through credential rather than capability. It's not philosophy, it's recognition that some jobs matter because they keep people safe rather than because they generate impressive profit margins. I rebuild systems so families don't wake up to disasters. What do you build? The question landed with more force than Garrett intended. Around them, conversations had gone quiet. people sensing conflict and leaning in with the kind of interest that came from watching social combat between people who operated in different weight classes. Preston's smile had frozen the civility cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. I'm a corporate attorney. I help companies navigate complex legal frameworks, protect their interests, ensure they can operate without liability. So you help companies avoid responsibility for harm they cause. Garrett kept his tone neutral, despite the accusation. You build arguments that let them keep profiting even when their actions hurt people. That's what protecting interests means, right? Finding legal ways to do things that would be morally questionable if anyone cared about morality more than profit. The ballroom had gone almost silent now, the confrontation drawing attention from executives who probably weren't used to seeing people challenge Preston's authority. Kate stood frozen beside Garrett, her expression unreadable, but her grip on his arm like iron. Preston's face had gone red, anger bleeding through expensive civility. You have no idea what you're talking about. Corporate law is complex, nuanced. It requires sophisticated understanding of regulatory frameworks that someone in your position couldn't possibly comprehend. You're right. I don't understand how you justified tearing apart families to win custody battles. I don't comprehend the nuance of using an 8-year-old boy as a weapon against his mother. I can't grasp the sophisticated legal framework that lets you tell your son that his mother doesn't love him so you can prove she's emotionally inadequate. The accusation hung in the suddenly silent ballroom. Preston's date had gone pale, the kind of uncomfortable that came from realizing she'd been hired to participate in something more complicated than a pleasant evening. Kate's hand trembled against Garrett's arm, shock and something that might have been gratitude making her grip unsteady. How dare you? Preston's voice had gone low, dangerous, the cultured veneer stripped away. You know nothing about my relationship with my son or the reasons I'm seeking custody. I know Liam thinks his mother doesn't love him because someone told him that. I know an 8-year-old is carrying adult trauma because the adults in his life are using him to hurt each other. I know you're building a case against Kate based on work patterns you encouraged during your marriage and then weaponized when the relationship ended. Garrett took a step forward, closing the distance between them. I'm a contractor. I fix broken things, but some things are broken on purpose, and those are the ones that matter most to repair. The shareable quote emerged without planning, the kind of observation that carried weight beyond the immediate context. Around them, executives were watching with expressions that ranged from shock to poorly concealed approval. Apparently, Preston wasn't universally beloved, and watching him get called out by a contractor in a cheap suit provided entertainment value worth the social awkwardness. Preston opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to calculate that continuing this public confrontation would only make things worse. Instead, he turned to Kate, voice dropping to something meant only for her ears, but loud enough that Garrett caught every word. You're dating a tradesman now. How egalitarian of you, Catherine. Very progressive. The court will be fascinated to hear about your new relationship and how you're exposing our son to such colorful influences. The threat was clear. Preston would use this evening, this confrontation, as evidence that Kate was making poor decisions and bringing inappropriate people into Liam's life. That a contractor who challenged wealthy men in public settings represented exactly the kind of instability Preston's lawyers were building their case around. Kate's expression had hardened, the vulnerability of earlier replaced by something cold and final. You know what, Preston? Bring it to court. Tell them I've befriended someone who values integrity over profit, who fixes problems instead of creating them, who teaches our son how to build things with his hands instead of tearing things down with legal arguments. Let's see which the judge values more. She turned and walked away, pulling Garrett with her through the crowd that parted like water. They made it to the valet station before either of them spoke, the night air cold enough to make breath visible and clarity sharp. I'm sorry, Kate's voice shook despite her attempt at control. I should have prepared you for Preston. Should have warned you he'd try to diminish you, that he uses class as a weapon when people threaten him. Nothing to apologize for. Garrett accepted the Mercedes keys from the valet, the young man's expression suggesting he'd heard about whatever just happened inside through whatever mysterious communication network staff maintained. I knew what I was walking into. Rich people at expensive parties who judge worth through bank accounts instead of character. Not exactly shocking territory. What you said in there, about fixing broken things. Kate climbed into the passenger seat, surrendering the driver's position for the first time since Garrett had known her. That was significant. People don't talk to Preston like that. He's used to deference to people treating him like he's important because of his firm and his connections and his family money. You treated him like he was just another person whose opinions didn't matter more than yours. His opinions don't matter more than mine. Garrett started the Mercedes, the engine responding with precision his truck could never match. Money doesn't make someone's judgment more valid. It just makes them louder about sharing that judgment. They drove in silence for several blocks. Boston's nighttime traffic lighter than daytime chaos, but still carrying the particular tension of a city that never fully slept. Kate stared out the window, processing something Garrett couldn't quite read. When we were married, I deferred to him constantly. Her voice was quiet confession, costing visible effort. Preston would say things, and I'd adjust my behavior, my opinions, my entire worldview to match his expectations. He thought the merger was frivolous. He thought my work schedule was excessive. He thought I was neglecting Liam. And I believed him. Internalized every criticism until I became exactly the person he said I was. That's what controlling people do. They make you doubt yourself until you can't tell the difference between their judgment and your own assessment. Garrett kept his eyes on the road, giving Kate the space to continue or stop as she needed. You called him out in front of everyone. She turned from the window to look at him. You defended me without asking permission or checking if that's what I wanted. You just saw something wrong and addressed it directly. Should I not have? The uncertainty was genuine. Garrett had acted on instinct, responding to Preston's condescension the way he'd respond to any bully. But maybe Kate had wanted to handle it herself to demonstrate strength without requiring rescue. No, I'm glad you did. I've spent so long adjusting to other people's expectations that watching someone act on principle instead of social calculation was startling. You didn't care that Preston has connections or that making him look bad might have professional consequences for me. You cared that he was being cruel and needed to be called out for it. The observation carried weight beyond the evening's events. Garrett heard what Kate wasn't quite saying. The recognition that she'd built a life around managing appearances and pleasing powerful people while forgetting that sometimes the right response to bullying was simply refusing to tolerate it. He's going to use tonight against you in court. Garrett stated the obvious, giving Kate room to process implications. He'll present me as unstable influence, claim you're making poor decisions in who you associate with, argue that exposing Liam to working-class contractors demonstrates lack of judgment. Let him. Kate's voice had hardened again, determination replacing vulnerability. Because I'd rather lose custody while standing up for what's right than win by continuing to be the person Preston wants me to be. That version of me was miserable and failing as a mother. If the court can't see the difference between growth and instability, then they're as broken as the systems you fix. The strength in her voice was new, or at least newly visible. Garrett wondered if Kate had always possessed this core of steel underneath the polished corporate exterior, or if Crisis was forging something harder from materials that had been too flexible for too long. They reached Finn's workshop. Around 10, the old man's truck still parked outside, suggesting he'd kept both kids entertained through the evening. Inside, Hazel and Liam were sprawled on the floor, surrounded by the dismantled radio they'd apparently decided to completely rebuild rather than simply repair. Both children looked up as the door opened, expressions bright with the kind of satisfaction that came from productive destruction. Did you have fun at the fancy party? Hazel's question was innocent enough, but her eyes tracked the tension in Garrett's posture with the kind of attention that missed nothing. It was educational. Garrett crossed to examine their radio project, impressed, despite himself, at the organization of components. You two make progress. We figured out how the tuner works. Liam's voice carried excitement that made him sound younger, the careful neutrality completely absent. Mr. McAllister showed us the schematic and we traced all the connections. It's actually not that complicated once you understand the signal flow. Finn emerged from his office, coffee mug in hand, an expression carrying the particular satisfaction of older men who'd successfully entertained children without modern technology's assistance. They'd been at it for 3 hours. Didn't hear a single argument or complaint. Just two kids teaching each other how electronics work, because apparently that's what passes for entertainment when you're not glued to screens. Kate stood in the doorway watching Liam with an expression Garrett had learned to recognize. Longing mixed with regret, the particular pain of parents who realized too late that they'd been missing moments that couldn't be recovered. Her son was engaged and happy, and learning all without requiring her presence or management. Garrett caught Finn's eye, and the old man nodded slightly, understanding passing between them without words. This was the lesson Kate needed to learn, but couldn't be taught through explanation. That children thrived when given space to explore and fail and figure things out with patient adults who didn't need to control every outcome. The drive back to Dorchester happened with Liam chattering in the back seat about radio waves and signal processing and all the things he and Hazel planned to build once they fully understood the principles. Kate responded with genuine questions, the engagement no longer performance, but actual interest in what her son found fascinating. When they reached Garrett's workshop to retrieve Kate's car, Liam climbed out and surprised everyone by hugging Garrett with the kind of unconscious affection that suggested he'd forgotten to maintain careful distance. Thanks for tonight, for letting me learn stuff with Hazel and Mr. McAllister. Anytime. Garrett returned the hug, the gesture easier than he'd expected. You're good at this, building and fixing things. Natural talent. The compliment made Liam glow with pleasure before he climbed into the Mercedes where Kate was waiting. They drove away, taillights disappearing into the night, leaving Garrett alone with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing he'd done something genuinely helpful. His phone buzzed with a text from Kate. Thank you. For tonight. For defending me. For showing Liam what it looks like when adults operate from integrity instead of calculation. I'm starting to understand what I've been missing. The message carried weight beyond gratitude. Garrett typed a response but deleted it 3 times before settling on honesty. You're not missing it anymore. You're learning. That's the whole point. Inside his workshop, evidence of the evening's projects remained scattered across workbenches and floor. The birdhouse, Hazel and Liam, had started the radio components waiting for reassembly, the tools that had been used and returned to their designated places, with the kind of care that showed respect for equipment. Garrett spent 30 minutes organizing the space, the physical work, helping process everything that had happened. The confrontation with Preston, Kate's gratitude, Liam's transformation from careful neutrality to genuine engagement, the weight of $3,000 a month and the responsibility that came with teaching someone to be a better parent when his own parenting was improvised at best. His phone buzzed again. This time the message was from Hazel, sent from Finn's phone since she didn't have her own. Yet, Dad, I like Liam. Can he come over more? Please. The request was simple but complicated by everything Garrett knew about temporary arrangements in 3-month timelines and custody battles that would determine whether Liam stayed in Boston or ended up wherever Preston decided to relocate. Getting Hazel attached to a boy who might disappear from their lives in a few months felt irresponsible. But teaching children to avoid connection because it might end badly seemed worse than the risk of eventual loss. He typed back, yes. He can come over more. We'll figure it out. The workshop settled into quiet, the kind of silence that came after days filled with noise and activity. Garrett locked up and headed home to the apartment he shared with Hazel, the space that had gone from married life to single parenthood without his permission, but with remarkable resilience. Tomorrow there would be more work, more lessons with Liam, more navigating Kate's transformation from corporate executive to mother who actually engaged with her son. But tonight he let himself feel something that might have been hope, that helping people change was possible, that 3 months might be enough to shift patterns that had been years in establishing, that sometimes the right response to drowning people was extending a hand even when you were barely staying afloat yourself. The thought sustained him through the drive home, through the quiet apartment where Hazel was already asleep, through the preparation for another day of fixing broken things, and hoping that repair was always possible if someone cared enough to try. December arrived with snow that transformed Boston from gritty urban landscape into something almost magical, the kind of weather that made children excited and adults remember why they paid heating bills that rivaled mortgage payments. The workshop's rhythm had evolved over 6 weeks into something that felt less like instruction and more like extended family Tuesday and Thursday evenings when Kate brought Liam for projects that taught practical skills while modeling the kind of patient engagement that couldn't be learned from parenting books. Kate was changing in ways that went beyond surface adjustments. The transformation showed in small moments that accumulated into patterns. She'd started leaving work at 5:30 instead of 7, the 2-hour shift creating space for actual presence instead of exhausted supervision. School pickup had become her responsibility rather than delegated tasks, the daily routine, allowing conversations that built connection through repetition and reliability. Bedtime stories happen now, Kate reading with Liam curled against her in ways that suggested comfort rather than obligation. But change was messy, the kind of process that involved failure and frustration, and moments when old patterns reasserted themselves with stubborn persistence. Garrett watched Kate struggle with the fundamental shift from managing Liam's life to participating in it, the difference between overseeing homework completion and actually helping with problems, between providing activities and sharing experiences. The cooking lessons were disasters that somehow became victories. Kate burned pasta 3 times before figuring out that boiling water required attention rather than multitasking. Her first attempt at pancakes produced substances that violated several laws of physics, somehow achieving both raw centers and burnt exteriors simultaneously. Liam found the failures hilarious, his laughter loosening something between them that formal success never could have achieved. Garrett observed these moments from his position at the workbench, offering guidance when requested, but mostly letting Kate figure things out through trial and error. Finn had taught him that the best lessons came from consequence rather than instruction, from experiencing what worked and what didn't, through direct engagement rather than theoretical understanding. You're supposed to flip the pancake before it turns completely black. Hazel offered this wisdom with the kind of patient condescension 6-year-olds reserved for adults who clearly needed help. See, the bubbles mean it's ready. If you wait until smoke happens, you've gone too far. Kate accepted the correction with grace Garrett wouldn't have predicted 2 months ago. She'd learned to laugh at herself, to treat mistakes as information rather than failure. The shift was fundamental, moving from perfectionism that paralyzed to experimentation that taught. Liam participated in his mother's education with growing confidence. He'd started offering preferences instead of waiting to be asked, expressing opinions about food and activities, and the small decisions that made up daily life. The change was subtle but significant, the boy claiming space he'd been taught to surrender in service of adult convenience. Thanksgiving complicated everything in ways Garrett hadn't anticipated. Kate had mentioned during the previous week's session that she'd be alone for the holiday, Liam spending it with Preston, per custody agreement, her own family scattered across distances that made travel impractical. The loneliness in her voice had been carefully controlled, but audible beneath professional composure. Finn had resolved the situation with characteristic directness. The old man had appeared at Garrett's workshop Wednesday evening, bringing his famous sweet potato casserole and an announcement that required no discussion. We're doing Thanksgiving at my place this year. Kate's coming because spending holidays alone is terrible for anyone. Both kids will be there because Liam gets back Friday morning, and I'm not about to let him miss proper turkey just because his father's an ass. The declaration had been delivered with enough finality that arguing seemed pointless. Garrett had learned long ago that Finn's generosity came wrapped in certainty that brooked no opposition. The old man's kindness expressing itself through actions rather than asking permission. Thanksgiving at Finn's workshop turned home had been chaotic in the best possible way. Kate arrived wearing jeans and a sweater that looked comfortable rather than carefully selected, her hair pulled back without the usual precision that suggested she'd stopped worrying about appearance long enough to just exist. She'd brought wine and store-bought pie with the kind of apologetic honesty that made everyone laugh, admitting she tried to bake from scratch before accepting that some skills remained beyond current capability. The meal stretched for hours, conversation flowing between adults, while Hazel taught Liam card games that involved elaborate rules she'd clearly invented that morning. Finn told stories about teaching Garrett to appreciate craftsmanship over speed, about learning patience through repetition and precision. Kate listened with the kind of attention that suggested she was filing everything away, absorbing lessons about mentorship and tradition, and the way values pass between generations through shared work. Later, while Finn and the kids played an increasingly competitive game of Uno that involved accusations of cheating and creative rule interpretation, Kate helped Garrett clean dishes in Finn's cramped kitchen. The domestic routine felt comfortable in ways that should have been awkward, the two of them navigating the small space with coordination that came from growing familiar with each other's presence. "This is nice." Kate handed him a plate to dry her voice, carrying something that might have been wistfulness, being part of something that feels like family instead of obligation. Preston used to make Thanksgiving into performance Everything perfect and precisely timed and completely exhausting. This is better. Family doesn't require perfection. Garrett dried the plate and added it to the stack on Finn's counter. Just requires showing up and caring about the people you are with. The observations settled between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Their arrangement had evolved past the transactional framework Kate had initially proposed. The boundaries between consultant and client, blurring into something that resembled actual friendship. Maybe more than friendship. If Garrett was honest about the way his chest tightened when Kate smiled genuinely, or how he looked forward to Tuesday and Thursday evenings with anticipation that went beyond professional interest. But acknowledging that shift meant confronting complications neither of them needed. Kate was still fighting for custody, still navigating the transformation from corporate executive to present mother. Garrett was still managing single parenthood and business obligations, and the grief that surfaced unexpectedly, despite 2 years of learning to function around the wound Natalie's death had left. Adding romantic possibility to existing complexity seemed like inviting disaster. The subject of payment hadn't come up in weeks. Kate transferred $3,000 on the first of each month with the efficiency of automated bills, the transactions appearing on Garrett's phone without comment or ceremony. The money had transformed his immediate circumstances. Hazel's dental work completed and the truck's transmission replaced with parts that suggested it might survive another year. The workshop's overdue rent had been settled, breathing room created where there had only been constant financial anxiety, but the money also carried weight that increased with each deposit. Garrett felt it like pressure behind his sternum, the knowledge that he was being paid to teach Kate how to love her son properly. The framing made something genuine feel transactional, reduced connection to commodity in ways that violated principles he'd been trying to model. Week 7 brought the breakthrough Garrett had been hoping for without knowing how to engineer. They'd been working on building a bookshelf for Liam's room, the project requiring precision and patience and the kind of focused attention that created space for conversation without demanding it. Hazel had taken herself to Finn's office for homework, declaring that watching other people measure wood was boring, and she'd rather do multiplication tables, a statement that revealed how terrible the entertainment value truly was. Liam was marking measurements with the careful concentration he brought to tasks that mattered, tongue poking out slightly in the focus gesture he shared with Hazel despite no biological relationship. Kate observed from her usual position present, without hovering, learning to give her son space to work without constant supervision. Mom Liam's voice was tentative, the question carrying weight beyond simple curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Kate had learned to respond with availability rather than judgment, to invite questions without performing the patience Garrett had taught her kids could sense instantly. "Why did you and Dad get divorced?" The question hung in the workshop's sawdust-scented air. Kate's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Garrett to track surprise and pain, and something that might have been relief that Liam was finally asking directly instead of carrying assumptions fed to him by adults with agendas. She crossed the workshop to kneel beside her son, the gesture bringing her to his eye level. "That's a complicated question with an even more complicated answer. The simple version is that your father and I married because it made sense on paper. We were both ambitious, both building careers, both from families that valued success and stability. But we didn't actually love each other. Not the way married people should. Dad says you chose work over him, over us." Liam kept his eyes on the wood. He was marking the statement delivered without accusation, but heavy with the weight of repeated narrative. "Your father says a lot of things. Some are true. Some are his version of truth, which isn't quite the same thing." Kate's voice remained steady despite visible struggle with honesty versus protection. "The truth is I did choose work too often. I let my career become more important than being present with you. But that wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I didn't know how to balance everything, and work was something I understood while motherhood felt impossible." Liam finally looked up, his serious eyes meeting Kate's with the kind of directness that demanded honesty rather than platitudes. "Do you love me now?" The vulnerability in the question broke something in Kate's composure. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to hide the raw emotion more powerful than any performance of strength. "Oh, sweetheart, I've always loved you, every single day since you were born. I just didn't know how to show it in ways that mattered to you. I was so busy trying to be perfect that I forgot to just be present." She pulled Liam into a hug, the boy's arms wrapping around her with desperate tightness that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment longer than either of them realized. Kate held her son and cried with the kind of messy honesty that came from giving up on control long enough to just feel everything she'd been suppressing. Garrett turned away to give them privacy, busying himself with tool organization that didn't need organizing. But he felt the significance of what was happening, the shift from performance to genuine connection. This was the moment that mattered more than any custody hearing, the repair of relationship that had been damaged by years of absence disguised as provision. When they separated, Kate wiped tears from Liam's face with her thumbs, the maternal gesture natural rather than learned. I'm learning how to be better at this, at being your mom instead of just providing for you. Garrett's been teaching me that kids don't need perfect parents. They need parents who admit when they mess up and who keep showing up even when it's hard. Is Garrett your boyfriend? The question emerged with the kind of innocent directness that made adult evasions impossible. Kate glanced at Garrett, who was very carefully not looking at them despite hearing every word. I don't know what Garrett and I are. We're friends, definitely. Maybe becoming more than friends. But that's something adults have to figure out slowly, because adding relationship complications to everything else happening right now would be very messy. The honesty surprised Garrett. He'd expected evasion or deflection, the kind of careful answer that avoided acknowledging possibility. Instead, Kate was admitting uncertainty with the same vulnerability she'd shown about her parenting failures, treating her son like someone capable of understanding nuance. I like him. Liam's endorsement was matter of fact. And Hazel's really cool. If you guys get married, can she be my sister? The question created tension that Garrett felt across the workshop. Kate's expression cycled through emotions too complex to name the boys' casual assumption of future permanence, highlighting how temporary their arrangement was supposed to be. 3 months. That had been the agreement. February was approaching, the custody hearing looming like deadline for transformation that either would or wouldn't be sufficient to change court decisions. Let's not plan weddings quite yet. Kate's attempt at lightness didn't quite mask her discomfort. How about we focus on finishing your bookshelf and then figure out what comes next? The deflection was gentle but clear. Liam accepted it with the resilience of children who'd learned that adults controlled timelines, and questioning that control rarely changed outcomes. He returned to measuring wood, the moment of vulnerability closing as quickly as it had opened. But something had shifted. Garrett felt it in this way. Kate's eyes found his across the workshop, in the unspoken acknowledgement that whatever they were building extended beyond their original parameters. The question was whether that expansion strengthened their foundation or introduced complications that would eventually cause structural failure. Week 8 arrived with bitter cold and the kind of early darkness that made 5 p.m. feel like midnight. Hazel had been unusually quiet during the day, processing something Garrett couldn't quite identify through his daughter's careful neutrality. She'd learned that particular expression from him, the way of hiding emotion behind competent functionality that got you through difficult moments without falling apart. After dinner, while Garrett was organizing paperwork in his workshop office, Hazel appeared in the doorway holding something that made his stomach drop. The check was from Kate's business account made out to Holloway Systems Repair for $3,000 dated December 1st. It must have fallen from the pile of bills Garrett kept meaning to properly file landing somewhere. Hazel's thorough room cleaning had discovered it. Dad? Her voice was small, uncertain, the tone she used when she knew something was wrong, but didn't want to believe her assessment. Why is Miss Kate paying you so much money? Garrett's first instinct was evasion, the parental impulse to protect children from adult complications. But he'd promised himself after Natalie died that he'd be honest with Hazel even when honesty was uncomfortable. Lying created distance that became impossible to bridge later once children learned their parents couldn't be trusted with truth. She's paying me to teach her how to be a better parent to Liam. The explanation sounded worse spoken aloud than it had living in the careful compartments Garrett had built to justify his choices. Kind of like hiring a consultant, except instead of teaching her about business, I'm teaching her about connecting with her son. Hazel stared at the check, her small face serious with the kind of judgment children wielded when adults violated principles they themselves had taught. But Dad, you told me we don't take money for things that should be free. You said helping people is what good people do, not what people get paid for doing. The echo of his own words felt like accusation. Garrett had taught his daughter that integrity meant doing right regardless of reward. That character revealed itself through actions taken when no one was watching, and nothing was gained beyond knowing you'd behaved honorably. He'd built Hazel's moral framework around principles that apparently didn't apply when financial pressure made compromise convenient. You're right. The admission cost him the simple acknowledgement that he'd failed to meet the standards he'd set for his daughter. I took money for something I should have done because I cared, not because I was getting paid. That was wrong of me. Hazel's expression shifted from judgment to something more complicated. But we needed the money for my teeth and the truck and rent. I heard you on the phone with Grandma talking about how tight things were. If Ms. Kate wanted to pay you, why is that bad? The question revealed wisdom beyond 6 years, the practical recognition that moral absolutes look different when actual needs pressed against ideals. Garrett pulled his daughter into his lap, the gesture automatic comfort that helped him think through explanations that honored both truth and complexity. Taking money isn't automatically bad. I charge for my work fixing things, and that's appropriate because my time and skill have value. But this is different. Kate needed help learning how to connect with Liam. That's not the same as hiring someone to repair a pipe. It's more personal, more important than something you should be able to purchase like any other service. So you shouldn't have charged her. I shouldn't have taken payment for being her friend and helping her figure out how to be a better mom. The distinction felt clearer now spoken to his daughter, who'd cut through adult rationalizations to expose the fundamental issue. What I should have done is helped because it was right, not because I needed money badly enough to accept payment for something that should have been freely given. Hazel processed this in silence, her small hand playing with the check that had sparked this crisis. Are you going to give the money back? The question-forced decision Garrett had been avoiding since Kate's first payment arrived. He'd told himself the arrangement was legitimate, that parenting consultation was real service worth compensation. But the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. He'd taken money for teaching someone to love their child properly, and that transaction cheapened something that should have been sacred. Yes, I'm going to give all of it back, every payment she's made. Because you're right, sweetheart. We don't take money for things that should be free. And helping Kate become the mother Liam deserves is something I should do because it matters, not because I'm getting paid. But what about my teeth in the truck? Hazel's practicality reasserted itself. If you give the money back, how do we pay for those things? We figure it out. The same way we figured everything out before Kate came into our lives. Garrett hugged his daughter, grateful for her moral clarity, even as it forced uncomfortable reckoning with his own compromises. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences that make life harder. But those consequences are better than living with knowing you violated your own principles when it mattered most. That sounds really hard. It is. But that's what integrity means. Doing the difficult thing because it's right even when the easy thing would solve immediate problems. Hazel nodded against his chest, accepting wisdom she'd one day understand more fully when life presented her with similar choices between principle and convenience. For now, she trusted that her father knew what he was doing, that his decisions came from a place of moral certainty rather than convenient rationalization. After Hazel went to bed, Garrett sat in his workshop office and calculated what returning Kate's money would mean. $9,000 already paid across 3 months. Money that had transformed their circumstances from barely managing to actually stable, from constant anxiety about unexpected expenses to breathing room that felt almost comfortable. Giving it back meant returning to precarious financial situation, the careful mathematics of which bills could be delayed and which demanded immediate attention. It meant Hazel's dental work becoming debt instead of completed treatment, meant the truck's new transmission going on credit card that charged interest rates that made Garrett's stomach turn. But keeping the money meant living with the knowledge that he'd sold something that shouldn't have price tags attached, that he'd taught Kate about integrity while violating his own through accepting payment for lessons that should have come from a place of genuine care rather than contractual obligation. The choice wasn't really choice at all, just delayed acknowledgement of what he'd known was wrong from the beginning. He'd taken Kate's money because he'd needed it, desperately justified through semantic games about consultation and services rendered. But Hazel had seen through the rationalizations with the kind of clarity that came from principles not yet compromised by adult necessity. Garrett wrote a check for $9,000, the amount leaving his business account in precarious condition, but returning what he'd taken for work that should never have been transactional. The physical act of signing the check felt like both loss and relief, the tangible cost of integrity when integrity demanded sacrifice. His phone buzzed with text from Kate. Liam told me today was the best day he's had in months. Thank you for teaching me that connection matters more than perfection. Whatever we're paying you isn't enough for what you've given us. The irony of the timing was almost painful. Garrett stared at the message, the check in his hand representing rejection of the exact sentiment Kate was expressing. He typed response and deleted it 3 times before settling on honesty that would require more explanation than text aloud. Can we talk tomorrow? In person, there is something I need to discuss. Kate's reply came immediately. Of course, is everything okay? The question didn't have simple answer. Everything was simultaneously fine and complicated and changing in ways Garrett wasn't sure either of them had fully processed. He settled for, we'll talk tomorrow. It's important, but not an emergency. Sleep came in fragments that night, Garrett's mind cycling through tomorrow's conversation and the implications of returning money that had fundamentally altered their relationship's foundation. Without the formal consultant arrangement, what were they? Friends who'd grown close through shared purpose. Something more that neither had named because naming made it real and real meant vulnerable. The morning brought responsibilities that didn't care about existential uncertainty. Bills needed paying, work demanded attention. Hazel required breakfast and conversation and all the small rituals that structured their days. But underneath normal routine, Garrett carried the weight of the check in his pocket and the conversation that would reshape whatever he and Kate had built. They met at his workshop Tuesday evening, the space empty of children, because Garrett had asked Finn to watch both Hazel and Liam at his place. Whatever this conversation became, it needed privacy that disappeared when kids were present and listening with the kind of attention adults assumed they didn't possess. Kate arrived wearing concern that creased her forehead, despite attempt at composure. Is this about the custody hearing? Did Preston's lawyers contact you? Because my attorney said they might try to intimidate any witnesses who'd testify about my changed behavior. It's not about Preston. Garrett gestured her toward his office, the cramped space feeling even smaller, with tension filling it. It's about us, about the arrangement we made, and how that arrangement has become something I can't continue. Kate's expression shifted to something close to panic. Are you ending our agreement? Because if this is about money, I can adjust the amount. Or if it's about time commitment being too much, we can reduce the schedule. Whatever you need, I'll accommodate it. The desperation in her voice made what Garrett needed to do harder, but more necessary. He pulled the check from his pocket and set it on the desk between them. $9,000 representing every payment she'd made since their arrangement began. I'm ending the financial aspect of our arrangement. Not because you did anything wrong or because I don't want to help anymore, but because I took money for something I should have done as your friend. And continuing to accept payment makes everything we've built feel like transaction instead of genuine connection. Kate stared at the check, incomprehension replacing panic. I don't understand. You've been teaching me to be better mother to my son. That's valuable service that deserves compensation. Returning my money suggests my gratitude and your work aren't worth anything. Your gratitude is worth everything. That's exactly the problem. Garrett kept his voice steady despite emotional turmoil underneath. When I started this, I told myself I was providing legitimate consulting service. But somewhere between then and now, I stopped teaching because I was getting paid and started helping because I care about you and Liam. Taking your money for that caring makes it feel like I'm selling something that should be freely given. Hazel found one of the checks. Her 6-year-old moral clarity pointed out that her father was violating principles he'd taught her. And she's right. I tell my daughter that we help people because it's right, not because we get paid for it. Then I turn around and accept thousands of dollars for teaching you how to love your son properly. That's hypocrisy at best, exploitation at worst. Kate's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the check, studying it like artifact from relationship neither of them fully understood anymore. So what are we now? If you're not my consultant, if you're not being paid, what does that make our relationship? The question demanded honesty. Neither of them had been brave enough to voice until circumstances forced it. Garrett thought about Tuesday and Thursday evenings that had become highlights of his week, about the way his chest tightened when Kate smiled about Thanksgiving dinner and the comfortable domesticity of washing dishes together while kids played in the next room. I don't know. The admission was harder than returning the money. I know we started as contractor and client. Then we became consultant and person seeking advice. Somewhere along the way, we became friends. And lately I've been wondering if we're becoming something more than friends, which terrifies me because I'm not sure either of us is ready for that kind of complication. Kate set the check down, her expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. When Preston and I divorced, I promised myself I wouldn't get involved with anyone until I figured out how to be the person I wanted to be instead of the person circumstance had made me. That's why I hired you, to learn how to change, how to be better mother, how to break patterns that had been years in forming. But you're right. What we've built isn't consultant and client anymore. It's not even just friendship. It's something that doesn't have easy labels because it developed organically while we were both focused on helping Liam. So what do we do? Garrett heard the vulnerability in his own question, the admission that he had no blueprint for navigating territory they'd stumbled into without map or guidance. Kate stood and moved to the small window overlooking the workshop, her back to Garrett, as she processed whatever internal calculation was happening. I don't want to lose what we've built. Not the parenting help, though, that's been invaluable, but the friendship, the connection, the feeling that someone sees me as more than just successful executive or failing mother. You see all of me, including the parts I've been trying to hide, and you haven't run away or judged me incapable. That matters more than any amount of money. She turned back to face him, decision made. Keep the money, not as payment for services, but as gift from someone who has more than enough to someone who could use help. You've transformed my relationship with my son. You've taught me what integrity looks like when it costs something to maintain. The least I can do is help make your life slightly easier so you're not constantly stressed about money while doing work that actually matters. The offer was generous and completely missed the point. Garrett shook his head, the gesture gentle but firm. I can't accept gift that large. Not because of pride, but because it would still make our relationship feel unbalanced. You'd be the wealthy woman helping the struggling contractor, and that dynamic creates power differential that undermines the equality friendship requires. Kate's frustration was visible in the tension of her shoulders. So we're both too proud to accept help from each other that seems like recipe for disaster rather than sustainable relationship. The word relationship hung between them, neither quite friend nor lover, but something undefined that contained elements of both. Garrett thought about Natalie, about the grief that still surfaced unexpectedly, despite 2 years of learning to function around it. About whether he was ready to risk his heart again when the last time he'd loved someone completely had ended with identifying her body and explaining to their daughter why mommy wasn't coming home. I'm scared. The confession emerged without planning raw honesty that felt dangerous but necessary. After Natalie died, I built my life around keeping Hazel safe and managing grief and making sure we both survived, even when surviving felt impossible. Getting involved with you means opening myself up to possibility that I could lose someone I care about again. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough to survive that twice. Kate crossed the space between them, her movement decisive despite the vulnerability in her expression. I'm scared too. Preston spent 10 years teaching me that I wasn't enough, that my career success couldn't compensate for emotional inadequacy, that I'd never be the kind of partner anyone would actually choose rather than settle for. Getting involved with you means risking proving him right, that I'm fundamentally broken in ways that make real intimacy impossible. So we're both terrified of repeating past damage. Garrett heard the parallel in their fears, the way they'd both been wounded by loss and were trying to navigate new connection without letting old trauma dictate present choices. Seems like good foundation for healthy relationship. Kate's attempt at humor was undercut by tears gathering in her eyes. Two damaged people trying to figure out if they can build something functional from broken pieces. Maybe that's exactly what makes it possible. Garrett reached for her hand, the gesture smaller than anything dramatic, but weighted with significance that grand gestures never achieved. We both know what it's like to lose what matters most. That shared understanding might be what lets us appreciate what we're building instead of taking it for granted. Kate's fingers closed around his, her grip surprisingly strong. So what do we do? Continue meeting Tuesday and Thursday, but without financial arrangement. Figure out if what we have survives when there's no contract requiring us to spend time together, We figure out what this is by letting it develop naturally instead of defining it prematurely. Garrett pulled her slightly closer, the movement tentative but deliberate. No more consultant arrangement. No more payment for friendship. Just two people who care about each other, trying to help a boy become confident in his mother's love while navigating whatever this connection between us becomes. The kiss happened without conscious decision from either of them, just natural culmination of weeks of growing attraction they'd both been carefully ignoring. Kate's lips were soft against his tentative, but responding with hunger that suggested she'd been wanting this as long as he had. The kiss was brief, cautious testing whether physical intimacy matched the emotional connection they had been building. When they separated, Kate's expression had shifted to something that might have been hope mixed with residual fear. That was unexpected. Not unwelcome, just unexpected. Everything about us has been unexpected. Garrett kept his hands on her waist, the contact grounding them both. We started with infrastructure emergency and evolved into whatever this is through series of moments neither of us planned. Maybe unexpected is our pattern. Kate laughed softly, the sound carrying relief that came from finally acknowledging what they'd both been dancing around for weeks. We should probably talk about logistics. About how this affects Liam and Hazel, about what we tell people about how we navigate the custody hearing in February, when Preston's lawyers will definitely use any new relationship as evidence of my instability. All valid concerns that we'll address. Garrett released her reluctantly, the practical considerations reasserting themselves, despite wanting to ignore everything except the fact that he'd just kissed someone for the first time since Natalie died, and it hadn't felt like betrayal. But tonight, can we just acknowledge that something significant shifted and deal with complications tomorrow deal? Kate picked up the check from his desk, the $9,000 that had sparked this entire conversation. I'm still leaving this, not as payment, but as gift to friend who's done more for me than money could ever compensate. You can accept it or tear it up, but either way, I'm not taking it back. The check represented more than money symbol of the transition from transactional arrangement to something undefined but genuine. Garrett took it and folded it carefully, the gesture deliberate. I'll hold on to it, not to cash, but as reminder that integrity sometimes costs more than we want to pay, but always provides returns that money can't measure. The shareable line emerged naturally, observation that captured both the evening's crisis and resolution. Kate smiled, the expression transforming her face from beautiful to radiant. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to teach Liam. The difference between price and value, between what things cost and what they're worth. They spent another hour in the workshop office talking through implications and concerns and the thousand small details that complicated relationships required. How to tell the kids that their relationship had evolved without creating expectations about permanent family structure that might not materialize. How to maintain appropriate boundaries while acknowledging genuine connection. How to support each other through the upcoming custody hearing without making Kate's relationship status the focus of court proceedings designed to assess her parenting capability. By the time Kate left close to midnight, with snow falling in the kind of gentle accumulation that would make morning commutes treacherous, Garrett felt simultaneously lighter and more burdened than he had in months. Lighter because he'd resolved the integrity crisis that had been pressing against his conscience since accepting Kate's first payment. Burdened because he'd acknowledged feelings he'd been suppressing, opening himself to vulnerability that came with caring about someone new. His phone buzzed as Kate's taillights disappeared into the snowy darkness. Finn's message was characteristically direct. Got both kids settled for the night. They're fine. You okay? Because you had that look earlier, that means you're about to do something noble and expensive. Garrett typed back, returned all Katie's payments, acknowledged we're more than friends, generally made life more complicated while trying to simplify it. Finn's response came quickly. Sounds about right for you, noble and expensive, but probably the right choice even if it costs you. The affirmation mattered more than Garrett wanted to admit. Finn had been steady presence through Natalie's death and the impossible months after the mentor who transformed into something closer to father when Garrett's actual father had proven incapable of supporting anyone's grief except his own. The old man's approval carried weight that made sacrifice feel worthwhile. Inside the empty workshop, Garrett sat with the check Kate had tried to give him and thought about integrity's actual cost. $9,000 that would have provided security and breathing room returned. because accepting it violated principles he'd been trying to model for his daughter. The choice should have felt good virtuous sacrifice made in service of ideals. Instead, it felt complicated, the kind of decision that honored abstract principles while creating practical problems that would ripple through coming months. But Hazel had been right in her 6-year-old clarity. You couldn't teach children that character mattered more than convenience and then compromise that character when convenience became necessity. The February custody hearing loomed less than 2 months away deadline for Kate's transformation from emotionally unavailable executive to mother capable of prioritizing her son. The pressure had been building for weeks, each interaction with Liam carrying weight beyond the immediate moment, every choice assessed for how it would appear to judge evaluating parenting capability. But tonight had shifted something fundamental. They were no longer contractor and client navigating professional relationship with clear boundaries and defined endpoints. They were two people who cared about each other, trying to build something real while managing complications that made simplicity impossible. Garrett's phone buzzed one final time. Kate's message was simple but carried weight that made his chest tight. Thank you for seeing me clearly and caring anyway, for teaching me that some things matter too much to have price tags attached, for risking your heart when you have every reason to keep it protected. I don't know what we're building, but I'm grateful we're building it together. He didn't respond immediately, letting the words settle and taking time to process everything the evening had contained. The confrontation with Hazel, the return of money that had changed their circumstances, the kiss that acknowledged feelings they'd both been suppressing, the conversation about fear and vulnerability, and whether two damaged people could create something functional from their respective brokenness. Eventually he typed, "We'll figure it out. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of honesty at a time. That's all anyone can do." The workshop settled into quiet tools in their designated places and projects at various stages of completion, representing both work accomplished and work still waiting. Garrett locked up and headed home through snow that had transformed Boston into something softer than usual, the city's harsh edges temporarily gentled by weather that made everything look cleaner than it actually was. Tomorrow would bring new complications, the practical reality of navigating relationship that existed outside traditional definitions. But tonight, Garrett let himself feel something that might have been hope. That integrity could survive, compromise that connection was possible after devastating loss, that building something new didn't require betraying what had come before. The thought sustained him through the drive to Finn's workshop, to collect Hazel, through the careful navigation of explaining to his daughter that he'd done what she'd known was right, even though it would make their lives harder, through the bedtime routine that remained constant, regardless of how much everything else shifted. Hazel listened to his explanation about returning Kate's money and acknowledged the developing relationship between adults with the practical acceptance of children who'd learned that grown-ups needed to figure things out messily before arriving at clarity. She asked one question that cut through everything else. Do you love her, Garrett? Thought about honesty and protection and whether children needed complete truth or age-appropriate version that preserved innocence while acknowledging reality. He settled on something between, I don't know yet, but I care about her a lot and I care about Liam. That's the beginning of love, maybe. We'll see if it develops into something more. Hazel nodded, satisfied with answer that didn't pretend certainty adults didn't possess. Okay, but Dad, if you do love her, that's okay. You loving someone new doesn't mean you stop loving Mom. Love doesn't work like that. The wisdom from 6-year-old was humbling permission granted from daughter who understood better than Garrett did that hearts expanded rather than replaced, that new love didn't diminish what had come before. He hugged Hazel and thought about Natalie, about whether she'd approve of what he was building with Kate. The answer came with surprising certainty. Natalie had valued honesty and kindness and the courage to keep trying after failure. She'd have liked Kate's transformation from corporate executive to mother, learning to prioritize presence over perfection. Would have appreciated the vulnerability both of them were showing as they navigated territory neither fully understood. That night, sleep came easier, despite the complications tomorrow would bring. Garrett had made choice that honored his principles, even when honoring them cost something significant. He'd acknowledged feelings that made him vulnerable after years of careful emotional protection. He'd risked opening his heart to possibility that caring about someone new might not end in devastating loss. The risk was real, the vulnerability genuine, the potential for pain substantial. But living meant risking, and parenting meant modeling courage even when courage was terrifying. If he wanted Hazel to grow up believing connection was worth pursuing, despite life's capacity for sudden tragedy, he needed to demonstrate that belief through action rather than just words. Tomorrow would begin the work of integrating new relationship structure into lives already complicated by custody battles and grief and the practical demands of raising children as imperfect adults doing their best. But tonight, Garrett let himself believe that maybe possibly with enough honesty and patience and willingness to be vulnerable, they could build something that honored both their pasts and their potential futures. The thought was enough. For now, it was enough.